You think you know what beauty looked like in the 1950s. You've seen the photographs, the carefully staged magazine spreads with women in perfect dresses and painted smiles, the advertisements for cold cream and lipstick that promised transformation in a jar. The movies where everyone looked like they'd been dipped in porcelain and set under studio lights. You think you know that decade. You think you know what women did to feel beautiful, to be seen, to survive in their own skin. But here's what nobody tells you. There was an entire world of beauty knowledge in 1950s America that never made it into those magazines, an entire system of care, of ritual, of handed-down wisdom that moved through kitchens and living rooms and church basements and beauty parlors that existed in a completely separate universe from anything you'd find in a department store. And the women who carried this knowledge, who perfected it, who taught it to their daughters and nieces and neighbors, were doing something far more complex than just getting ready. They were practicing survival. They were practicing defiance. They were practicing a kind of beauty science that white America didn't even know existed. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you right now? Are you in bed, finally still after a long day? Are you on a couch somewhere with the lights down low? Maybe you're in a car, in the passenger seat, watching streetlights blur past. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. And here's what I want you to do. Down in the comments, I want you to tell me what historical topic you want me to cover next. It doesn't have to be beauty. It doesn't have to be the 1950s. It could be food, or war, or forgotten jobs, or strange laws, or anything that makes you curious about how people actually lived before you got here. Be specific. Be weird. I'll read them all. And who knows? Your comment might become the next video that puts you to sleep 6 months from now. Wouldn't that be something? You suggesting the very thing that eventually calms your mind on some random Tuesday in the future. Now, back to 1954. You're a black woman living in Atlanta, or Chicago, or Durham, or Los Angeles. You work 5, maybe 6 days a week. Maybe you're cleaning someone else's house. Maybe you're teaching school. Maybe you're working in a factory or a hospital, or standing behind a counter somewhere selling things you can't afford to buy. Your feet hurt. Your back hurts. The world outside is not designed to be kind to you. There are places you cannot go. There are doors that will not open. There are faces that will not see you, or worse, will see you only as something to be avoided, dismissed, or controlled. And yet, on Sunday morning, you will look like royalty. Your hair will be perfect. Your skin will glow. Your dress will be pressed so sharp it could cut glass. You will smell like rosewater and Jergens lotion and something else, something your grandmother made from ingredients she won't write down because the recipe lives in her hands, in her memory, in the rhythm of how she heats the oil and adds the beeswax and stirs it exactly long enough but never too long. Here's the contradiction that should stop you in your tracks. In an era when the beauty industry spent millions of dollars telling women that they needed expensive products to be lovely, when advertisements screamed that only science and laboratories could make you desirable, black women in America were using mayonnaise. They were using bacon grease. They were using eggs, and petroleum jelly, and cotton sheets torn into strips, and brown paper bags, and irons heated on actual stoves, and lye mixed in coffee cans, and aloe vera plants growing on windowsills, and shea butter that came in unlabeled tins passed from hand to hand like currency. And it worked. Not sometimes, not sort of, it worked so well that the results were undeniable. Hair that had been told by the entire culture that it was wrong, that it was bad, that it needed to be fixed or hidden or straightened into submission, became healthy. Strong, glossy, long. Skin that had been ignored by every major cosmetic company in America. Skin that couldn't find foundation in its shade. Skin that was supposed to just make do, glowed, aged slowly, stayed soft in climates that should have dried it out. The women who knew these secrets didn't call them secrets, they called them common sense. But they were secrets because they were never written down in the places where history gets recorded. They didn't appear in Vogue or Harper's Bazaar or Life magazine. There were no patents filed, no celebrities endorsed them, no laboratories tested them. And so when we look back at the 1950s now, we see the commercial beauty industry, the one that was sold and packaged and advertised. We don't see the other one, the invisible one, the one that actually worked. You might be wondering why this matters now, here, tonight, as you're trying to let your mind slow down. It matters because we've been lied to about who had knowledge and who didn't. We've been told that science and progress and modernity came from laboratories and corporations and experts in white coats. We've been told that traditional knowledge was quaint, or old-fashioned, or something grandmothers did before they knew better. We've been sold the story that real beauty, real care, real transformation could only come from stores, from brands, from things you had to buy. But in the 1950s, while white women were being told to buy a dozen different products for a dozen different problems, black women were opening their kitchen cabinets and solving those same problems with 3 ingredients and knowledge that had survived slavery, migration, poverty, and every attempt to erase it. That's not nostalgia. That's not romanticism. That's documentation. And here's the other piece that should make you pause. Most of these methods still work, right now, today. In 2025, with all our serums and acids and retinols and 10-step routines, the things that black women were doing 70 years ago in kitchens with no running hot water will still give you better results than half the products being sold to you on Instagram. So the question becomes, what else were we wrong about? What else did we miss because we weren't looking in the right rooms, listening to the right voices, or asking the right women what they knew? That's what we're here to find out. Not in a hurried way, not in a frantic, take notes, remember this for the test kind of way. But slowly, the way you'd hear a story from someone who lived it, the way knowledge actually moves, from mouth to ear, from hand to hand, from one generation to the next, in low voices and warm kitchens and moments when someone finally says, "Let me show you how we really did it." So settle in. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. This is going to take a while, and that's exactly the point. We're going to move through this like we have all the time in the world, because the women we're talking about didn't rush either. They couldn't afford to. Their beauty routines weren't indulgences. They were rituals. They were preparation. They were resistance. And they knew things we forgot. Let's go find out what they were. Here's the version of 1950s beauty you've been given. Poodle skirts and red lipstick. Marilyn Monroe standing over a subway grate with her white dress billowing up. Audrey Hepburn with her pixie cut and perfect eyebrows. Grace Kelly looking like she was born wearing pearls. The image is so clean, so specific, so color-coordinated that it almost doesn't seem real. And that's because it wasn't. That version of the 1950s, the one that lives in our collective imagination, the one that gets reproduced in themed diners and Halloween costumes and Pinterest boards, was a commercial fantasy even when it was happening. It was designed. It was sold. It was an advertisement for a lifestyle that most women, white or black, could not afford and did not live. But here's where it gets even more distorted. When we talk about beauty in the 1950s, we're almost always talking about white beauty. The magazines were white, the movie stars were white, the advertisements were white, the models were white, the standards were white. And so the entire historical record of what beauty looked like in that decade, what women did to achieve it, what products they used, what routines they followed, is told from a white perspective, sold by white companies, and remembered through white nostalgia. Black women simply don't appear. Or when they do appear, they show up as maids in the background of movies, or as mammies in advertisements for pancake mix, or as Aunt Jemima smiling from a syrup bottle. They are never shown as beautiful. They are never shown caring for themselves. They are never shown as women who might have their own knowledge, their own rituals, their own standards of beauty that existed completely independent of white approval. And so what we inherited is a half-truth. We inherited the idea that beauty in the 1950s meant conformity. It meant looking like everyone else. It meant erasing anything different, anything ethnic, anything that didn't fit the mold. We were told that women straightened their hair because straight hair was better. We were told they lightened their skin because lighter was more desirable. We were told they tried to look white because whiteness was the standard. And some of that is true. Some of that did happen. The pain of colorism is real. The pressure to assimilate was crushing. But that's not the whole story. Because at the same time that some black women were buying skin bleaching creams sold by companies that hated them, other black women were mixing shea butter with coconut oil in their kitchens and passing the recipe to their daughters with explicit instructions to never let their skin dry out, to never let the world make them believe they needed to be lighter. At the same time that some women were using harsh lye relaxers that burned their scalps, other women were setting their hair with pin curls and sleeping in satin bonnets and deep conditioning with mayonnaise and egg yolks, creating curls and waves and styles that required no chemicals at all. At the same time that the beauty industry was ignoring black women entirely, not making products for them, not acknowledging they existed as consumers, black women were building their own beauty industry, in their homes, in their churches, in small shops that didn't advertise in white newspapers. They were becoming experts in hair care, in skin care, in makeup mixing, not because they were trying to imitate white beauty, but because they were trying to survive, to thrive, to look in the mirror and see themselves as worthy. Here's what the schoolbook version leaves out. It leaves out the innovation. Black women in the 1950s were chemists. They were experimenters. They were problem solvers working with limited resources and unlimited creativity. They couldn't walk into a drugstore and find products made for their hair texture or skin tone, so they made them. They tested them. They adjusted the ratios. They passed along what worked and discarded what didn't. They were also historians, whether they knew it or not. The methods they were using didn't come from nowhere. They came from grandmothers who came from the South, who came from women who had been enslaved, who came from women who remembered Africa, or whose mothers remembered, or whose grandmothers told stories about how things were done before the boats, before the chains, before everything was taken. So when a woman in 1955 rubbed castor oil into her scalp, she wasn't just conditioning her hair. She was performing an act that connected her to Jamaica, to West Africa, to centuries of women who knew that this particular oil, thick and golden and smelling faintly of earth, would make hair grow strong. When she wrapped her hair at night in a silk scarf, she wasn't being old-fashioned. She was protecting her investment. She was using a technique that had survived the Middle Passage, that had been adapted on plantations where there were no brushes and no mirrors, that had evolved through Reconstruction and migration and Jim Crow into something both practical and beautiful. The familiar version says, black women straightened their hair to look white. The reality says, some did, some didn't. And the ones who did often had reasons more complicated than self-hatred. Straightening your hair in 1950s America could mean you got the job. It could mean you weren't turned away from the store. It could mean your children weren't sent home from school. It could mean safety. It could mean access. It could mean survival. But it could also mean something else. It could mean style. It could mean experimenting with a different look, the same way women have experimented with their appearance in every culture across all of human history. It could mean that on Tuesday you wanted your hair straight and sleek, and on Sunday you wanted it curled and pinned, and neither choice was about hating yourself. Both were about control, about choice, about deciding how you wanted to present yourself to a world that was trying very hard to tell you that you had no choices at all. Here's another piece the familiar version gets wrong. It tells you that black women were trying to copy white beauty standards, but it never tells you that white women were also copying black women. The tanned skin that became fashionable in the late 1950s, that was seen as exotic, as desirable, while actual black skin was still discriminated against. The fuller lips that white women started drawing on with lip liner, borrowed. The curvier silhouettes that became popular, the emphasis on hips and waist, look at who actually had those bodies and had been shamed for them for decades. Even the music, the dances, the entire youth culture of the 1950s was built on rock and roll, which was built on rhythm and blues, which was built on black innovation that white teenagers consumed while black creators were often barred from the same venues. So the beauty exchange was never one direction. It was never just black women trying to look white. It was white culture taking, borrowing, stealing from black culture while simultaneously pretending it didn't exist, or didn't matter, or wasn't worth crediting. But we're not here to talk about what white women were doing. We're here to recover what black women knew. And what they knew was this. Beauty was not about having money. It was about having knowledge. You didn't need a department store. You needed a grandmother who would teach you. You needed a neighbor who knew which plants to grow. You needed a friend who worked at the hospital and could get you petroleum jelly in bulk. You needed a cousin who knew a woman who knew a woman who made the best hair pomade in the city and would sell it to you for 50 cents in a recycled jar. The version we were given says that beauty was individual. You bought your products, you did your routine, you presented yourself. The reality says that beauty was communal. You learned from watching. You shared what worked. You borrowed tools. You traded recipes. You sat in someone's kitchen for 3 hours while she braided your hair and told you about her week, and asked about yours, and gave you advice you didn't ask for but needed anyway. The beauty routine was the social structure. It was when women talked. When they taught, when they connected, when they passed down not just the method for setting hair, but the values, the warnings, the survival strategies, the history. And none of that made it into the magazines. None of that made it into the movies. None of that made it into the official record of what the 1950s looked like, or what women did, or what beauty meant. So when we look back now, we see the advertised version, the commercial version, the white version, and we miss the rest. We miss the women who were doing something far more sophisticated than anything being sold in stores. We miss the knowledge systems that were operating in plain sight, invisible only because no one with a camera or a printing press thought they were worth documenting. But they were worth documenting. And the proof is that the methods still work. 70 years later, the things those women knew, the ingredients they used, the techniques they practiced, will still give you healthier hair and clearer skin than most of what's being sold to you today. That's not nostalgia. That's evidence. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, we've been looking at the 1950s all wrong. Let's go back further. Because the beauty secrets of 1950s black women didn't start in the 1950s. They didn't start in America. They didn't even start with a single generation. They started centuries ago, in places that were destroyed, in cultures that were interrupted, in knowledge systems that survived only because women refused to forget. If you want to understand why a woman in Detroit in 1955 knew to rub shea butter on her skin every night before bed, you have to go back to West Africa. You have to go back to the women of the Sahel region, in what is now Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, who harvested the nuts of the shea tree, boiled them, kneaded them, whipped them into a cream that protected skin from the sun, from the dry wind, from the harshness of the climate. Shea butter wasn't a beauty product in the way we think of beauty products now. It was medicine, it was food, it was currency. It was a tool for survival in an environment that could crack your skin open and leave you vulnerable to infection, to pain, to death. The women who made it were specialists. They knew which trees produced the best nuts. They knew when to harvest. They knew how long to boil, how hard to knead, how to tell when the texture was right just by feeling it between their fingers. And when those women were stolen, when they were chained and put on ships and brought to a continent they'd never seen, they couldn't bring the shea trees with them. They couldn't bring the tools. They couldn't bring the containers or the workspace or the community of women who would normally teach the next generation. But they brought the knowledge. They brought the understanding that skin needs fat, that it needs protection, that certain plants, certain oils, certain methods of preparation can mean the difference between skin that cracks and bleeds and skin that stays soft enough to survive. So when they arrived in Virginia, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in places where there were no shea trees, they looked around and found what was available. They found pig fat. They found tallow. They found lard. They found plants they didn't recognize but learned to test, to experiment with, to see if they could do the same work. And later, much later, when some of them gained a small measure of freedom, when some of them could buy things, when some of them could trade, shea butter started arriving again. Brought by ships, sold in small quantities, passed from hand to hand in communities that remembered, even if they didn't always remember why, that this particular substance was worth having. By the 1950s, you could buy shea butter in certain neighborhoods, not in white stores, not in pharmacies, but from women who sold it in church basements, at social gatherings, through word of mouth. It came in unmarked tins. It was expensive. It was precious. And the women who used it knew they were using something old, something that connected them to a place they'd never seen, but that lived in their bodies, in their skin, in the cellular memory of what worked. That's one thread. Here's another. If you want to understand why black women in the 1950s wrapped their hair at night, you have to understand what hair meant before slavery, during slavery, and after. In many West African cultures, hair was a language. The way you wore your hair told people your age. your marital status, your tribe, your social position, your spiritual state. Hair was braided into intricate patterns that took hours, sometimes days, to complete. It was adorned with beads, with thread, with shells, with gold if you had it. Hair was not something you just let happen. It was something you crafted. It was art. It was communication. It was identity. And then slavery tried to erase all of that. Enslaved women had their heads shaved. They had no time for elaborate braiding. They had no tools, no oils, no mirrors, no community of women sitting together doing hair and talking and teaching. They had nothing, except they had their hands, and they had memory. So they started again. They braided in secret. They braided at night. They braided each other's hair after the work was done, using their fingers, using whatever they could find, string or strips of fabric or plant fibers. And they started using what was around them to keep their hair healthy. Bacon grease, lard, butter, any fat they could access, they would rub into their scalp, into their hair, to keep it from breaking, from drying out, from becoming so damaged it couldn't grow. This wasn't about beauty in the way we think of beauty now. This was about preventing pain, about preventing hair from matting so badly it had to be cut off, about maintaining enough control over your own body that you could still recognize yourself. And out of that necessity, techniques developed. Wrapping the hair at night to protect it. Braiding it close to the scalp to keep it manageable. Using cloth, using rags, using anything soft to cushion the hair while you slept. These weren't beauty tips. These were survival strategies. But they worked so well that they outlasted slavery. They survived Reconstruction. They survived Jim Crow. They survived migration from the rural South to the industrial North. And by the 1950s, they had evolved into something both practical and beautiful. A woman wrapping her hair at night in a silk scarf wasn't just protecting her hairstyle. She was performing a ritual that her grandmother had taught her, that her grandmother's grandmother had done, that stretched back through generations to a time before America even existed. The scarf itself became a symbol. In the house, it meant you were in your private self. You were preparing for rest. You were in the space where you didn't have to perform for anyone. But if you had to answer the door, if you had to step outside, if you had to be seen, you took it off, or you replaced it with a more decorative one, because you understood that hair, and the covering of hair, still meant something, still communicated something. Now, let's talk about hot combs. The metal comb that you heated on the stove and pulled through hair to straighten it temporarily. If you've never seen one, picture a regular comb but thicker, heavier, made of iron or steel, with a wooden handle so you didn't burn your hand. Most people think the hot comb was invented so black women could look white, but that's not where it came from. Heated tools for hairstyling existed in Africa. Combs made of bone or wood were sometimes warmed and used to shape hair into specific styles. The idea of using heat to manipulate hair texture is ancient, and it shows up in multiple cultures across the world. What happened in America was an adaptation. Someone, and there are debates about exactly who and exactly when, but someone figured out that if you heated a metal comb hot enough and pulled it carefully through tightly coiled hair, you could temporarily loosen the curl pattern. You could create a different texture. You could make the hair easier to style in certain ways. And this became incredibly popular, not because women hated their natural hair, but because it gave them options. You could wear your hair natural. You could braid it. You could twist it. You could pick it out into a fuller shape, or you could press it straight and curl it with rollers and create the kinds of styles that were fashionable at the time. The hot comb was a tool. Like any tool, it could be used skillfully or it could cause damage. In the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, who knew how hot was too hot, who knew how much tension to use, who knew to protect the hair with oil or grease first, it worked beautifully. In the hands of someone who didn't know, it burned, it broke hair, it damaged scalps. And so knowledge mattered. You learned from someone who knew. You watched. You practiced on yourself, on your sisters, on your daughters. You learned that you always tested the heat on a piece of paper first. You learned that you sectioned the hair carefully. You learned that you moved quickly but gently. You learned that you never ever pressed hair that was dirty, because the dirt would burn and the smell would never come out. This knowledge didn't come from a manual. It came from doing, from teaching. From the accumulation of thousands of women trying and failing and trying again, and eventually getting it right, and then showing the next person. By the 1950s, pressing hair was so common that almost every black woman either knew how to do it herself or knew someone who did it professionally. And the professionals, the women who ran beauty shops out of their homes or rented small storefronts in black neighborhoods, they were scientists. They knew hair. They knew that hair that had been chemically relaxed couldn't handle as much heat. They knew that fine hair needed lower temperatures than coarse hair. They knew that hair grew differently at the crown than it did at the nape of the neck. They knew that you couldn't use the same technique on a 5-year-old that you used on a 50-year-old. They knew all of this without ever going to beauty school, because there were no beauty schools that would teach them. They learned by apprenticeship, by inheritance, by trial and error and careful observation and respect for the craft. And they made money. Not a lot of money. Not the kind of money that white salon owners made, but enough to feed their families, enough to pay rent, enough to send their children to school, enough to matter. The beauty shop became a center. Not just a place to get your hair done, but a place to talk, to organize, to hear news, to find out who was hiring, who was sick, who needed help, who was getting married, who had died. In the 1950s, in the South especially, beauty shops were also political spaces. They were places where women talked about the things they couldn't talk about in public. They talked about civil rights. They talked about organizing. They talked about the boycotts, the protests, the strategies, and all of that organizing and thinking and planning happened while someone's hair was being washed, conditioned, pressed, curled, and styled. The beauty routine was never just about beauty. It was about creating space, about claiming time, about building networks, about passing down knowledge that was bigger than hair, bigger than skin, bigger than any single technique. It was about survival and memory and resistance, all at once. And it worked because the knowledge was sound. It worked because it had been tested across centuries, across continents, across conditions that should have destroyed it but didn't. By 1955, a black woman sitting in a beauty shop in Birmingham or Baltimore or Harlem was part of a chain that stretched back to women she would never know, in places she would never see, who had started this whole system of care with nothing but their hands and their refusal to forget. That's the origin. Not a product, not a brand, not an advertisement. A lineage. Now let's talk about what happened when money noticed. Because for a long time, black women's beauty practices existed outside of the formal economy. They existed in kitchens, in informal markets, in relationships of trust and barter and community. No one was getting rich. No one was building empires. It was small scale, local, personal. But by the early 1900s, that started to change. A few black entrepreneurs, and we have to say their names because they matter, Madam C.J. Walker, Annie Malone, Sarah Spencer Washington, they saw an opportunity. They saw that black women needed hair care products and had no access to them. They saw that white companies didn't care, didn't even see black women as potential customers, and they saw that if someone could create products specifically designed for black hair and sell them directly to black communities, there was money to be made. And they were right. Madam C.J. Walker became one of the wealthiest self-made women in America, black or white, by selling hair care products door to door, by training other women to sell them, by building a network that spread across the entire country. This was revolutionary. Not just because a black woman became wealthy, though that mattered, but because she did it by taking knowledge that had been informal, unofficial, passed down through generations, and she formalized it. She put it in bottles. She gave it labels. She wrote instructions. She created a system. And that system employed thousands of black women. It gave them income. It gave them independence. It gave them a business model they could replicate in their own communities. But it also changed something fundamental. It took beauty knowledge out of the realm of shared community practice and started turning it into a consumer product. Before, you made your own hair grease. You mixed it in your kitchen. You adjusted the recipe based on what you needed, what you could afford, what was available. After, you bought it. You bought it from a catalog, or from a saleswoman who came to your door, or from a shop. And that shift, from making to buying, was both liberating and limiting. Liberating because it saved time, because it gave you access to products that actually worked, that were designed for you, because it meant you didn't have to be a chemist in your own kitchen just to take care of your hair. Limiting because it made you dependent, because it meant that the knowledge, the recipes, the techniques, started to be seen as proprietary, as secrets that companies owned, rather than wisdom that communities shared. By the 1950s, there was a full-scale black beauty industry. There were products, advertisements, magazines, beauty schools, trade organizations. There were national conventions where beauty shop owners would gather to learn new techniques, see new products, network with each other. This was progress. This was economic power. This was black women creating wealth and employment and opportunity in a country that tried very hard to prevent them from doing any of those things. But it also meant that the beauty industry, even the black beauty industry, started to look more like the white beauty industry. It started to advertise. It started to create aspirations. It started to sell not just products, but dreams. And some of those dreams were about straightening. Here's where it gets complicated, and we have to be honest about it. Some of the most successful black-owned beauty companies in the 1950s made their money selling chemical relaxers, selling products that permanently straightened hair, selling the promise that you could have hair that was easier to manage, more socially acceptable, more aligned with mainstream beauty standards. And those products were damaging. The early relaxers used lye, the same chemical used to make soap, to break down the protein structure of hair. If you left it on too long, it burned your scalp. It caused hair to break off. It caused scarring. It caused pain. But women used them anyway. Why? Because the social pressure was enormous. Because having straight hair could mean better job prospects, less harassment, more access. Because the entire culture was telling them that their natural hair was unprofessional, unclean, unacceptable. And because the companies selling these products, even the black-owned ones, were using the same advertising tactics as white companies. They were selling transformation. They were selling acceptance. They were selling the idea that you needed to fix something that was broken. But here's the contradiction. At the same time that relaxers were being advertised and sold and used, there was also resistance. There were women who refused. Who said, "I'm not putting that chemical on my head"? Who kept pressing their hair with hot combs, or who wore it natural, or who braided it, or who found other ways? There were grandmothers who warned their granddaughters. Who said, "That stuff will burn you"? Who insisted on teaching the old methods, the kitchen methods, the methods that didn't require buying anything? There were beauty shop owners who specialized in natural styles, who learned how to cornrow, how to twist, how to loke, how to work with the hair as it was, rather than trying to force it into something else. And there were churches, community organizations, social clubs, where black beauty, natural black beauty, was celebrated, where women wore their hair in styles that were distinctly black, distinctly African, distinctly not trying to look like anything white. So even in the 1950s, even at the height of integration pressure, even when the culture was screaming that straight hair was the only acceptable hair, there was resistance. There was knowledge being preserved. There were women saying, quietly or loudly, that their hair was fine the way it was. And they kept using the old methods. They kept using shea butter. They kept using castor oil. They kept wrapping their hair at night. They kept deep conditioning with mayonnaise and eggs. They kept doing scalp massages. They kept growing aloe vera plants on their windowsills and breaking off a leaf when they needed it. They kept the knowledge alive, not because they were trying to make a political statement, though sometimes they were, but because the knowledge worked, because it had always worked, because it was cheaper, safer, more reliable than the commercial alternatives. Now let's talk about the role of the church. Because in the 1950s, for most black Americans, church wasn't just Sunday morning. It was the center of social life. It was where you saw people, where you made connections, where you showed yourself. And part of showing yourself was looking your best. Sunday morning was the beauty showcase. You wore your best dress, your best shoes, your best hat, and your hair had to be perfect. This created enormous pressure, but it also created standards, community standards, not standards imposed from outside, but standards that black communities set for themselves. And those standards were high. You couldn't just roll out of bed and show up. You had to put in the time, the effort, the care. And so Saturday became preparation day. You washed your hair, you conditioned it, you set it in rollers or pin curls. You sat under a dryer, or you slept in the rollers and let them air dry. You woke up early Sunday morning and styled it, pinning it into place, smoothing it, making sure every piece was exactly where it needed to be. This took hours, but it was expected. It was respected. It was part of the rhythm of the week. And the women who were best at it, who had the skills, the knowledge, the patience, they were valued. They were the ones other women came to for advice. They were the ones who did hair for weddings, for funerals, for special occasions. They were the ones who held the knowledge and passed it on. The church didn't just create pressure, it created community accountability. It created a system where beauty knowledge mattered, where it was visible, where it was celebrated, where it was taught. And because the church was outside of white control, because it was a space where black people set the standards and made the rules, the beauty practices that developed there were also outside of white influence. They were black standards, black aesthetics, black knowledge. And they survived because the church survived. Even as the commercial beauty industry grew, even as products became more available, even as some women started using relaxers and straightening their hair permanently, the church remained a place where you still had to show up looking like you'd put in the effort. And that effort, that care, that attention kept the knowledge alive. Because you can't achieve those results without knowing what you're doing. You can't just buy a product and hope for the best. You have to know your hair. You have to know what works. You have to have learned from someone who knows. And so the knowledge kept moving, from generation to generation, even as the world around it changed. By the end of the 1950s, the beauty industry had been reshaped by commerce, by integration pressure, by chemical innovation, by advertising. But underneath all of that, the old knowledge was still there, still being practiced, still being taught, still working. And the women who carried it forward knew something the advertisers didn't. They knew that beauty wasn't something you bought. It was something you learned. Let's put you in a specific place, on a specific day. It's Tuesday morning, 1956. You live in a neighborhood in Chicago, in a 3-room apartment, on the second floor of a building that used to be nice, but now just houses working people trying to get by. You share the bathroom down the hall with 2 other families. There's no hot water after 7 in the morning because everyone on the floor is trying to get ready for work at the same time. You woke up at 5:30. Not because you wanted to, because you had to. Because you work on the other side of the city, cleaning houses in a neighborhood where you're allowed to work but not allowed to live. Because the bus takes an hour if it's on time, longer if it's not. Because you have to be there by 8, and Mrs. Patterson, the white woman whose house you clean, doesn't care about traffic or late buses or anything except that you're standing in her kitchen at 8 o'clock ready to work. Before you left the house, you had a routine. You washed your face with cold water because the hot water was already gone. You used Pond's cold cream to take off the remnants of yesterday, rubbing it in circles across your skin, feeling the grease dissolve the dirt, the sweat, the tiredness. You wiped it off with a cloth that you'd wash later, by hand, in the kitchen sink. Then you moisturized. Not with something expensive, with petroleum jelly, Vaseline, the same thing you used on your children's knees when they were ashy, on your elbows, on your heels. You rubbed it into your face while your skin was still slightly damp, sealing in the moisture, creating a barrier against the cold wind outside and the dry heat inside Mrs. Patterson's house. You didn't have 10 products. You had 2. Cold cream to clean, petroleum jelly to protect. And your skin was perfect. Smooth, even-toned, glowing in a way that the white women you worked for would ask you about, in that curious, almost accusatory tone, like you were hiding something from them. What do you use on your skin? And you'd tell them, Vaseline. And they wouldn't believe you, because Vaseline was cheap. It came in a blue jar that cost 35 cents. It couldn't possibly be the secret to good skin. Surely you were using something else, something exotic, something they could buy if they just knew what it was. But you weren't lying. It was petroleum jelly, and it was water, and it was the fact that you never went to bed with a dirty face. And it was the fact that your mother had taught you and her mother had taught her that black skin needs moisture, needs fat, needs protection, and if you give it those things consistently, every single day, it will stay beautiful longer than skin that's stripped and scrubbed and treated with harsh soaps and alcohol-based toners. Your hair was wrapped. You'd done it the night before, after you got home from work, after you fed your children and cleaned your kitchen, and finally sat down on the edge of your bed with a brush and a jar of pomade that smelled like bergamot and something floral you couldn't quite name. You'd brushed your hair in sections, working the pomade through from root to tip, feeling the strands soften under your hands. Then you'd wrapped it, smoothing it around your head in a circular pattern, tucking the ends, pinning it in place, and tying it down with a silk scarf. Not satin, silk. Because your grandmother had told you that silk was better, that it didn't pull moisture from your hair the way cotton did, that it let your hair breathe while still protecting it. You couldn't afford new silk scarves, so you used old ones. Scarves that had been your mother's, or that you'd found at the thrift store, or that someone had given you. You washed them carefully by hand and hung them to dry, and treated them like they mattered, because they did. When you unwrapped your hair in the morning, it was smooth, shiny, laid flat against your head in a style that looked effortless but had taken you 15 minutes the night before to perfect. You didn't restyle it every morning. You couldn't. You didn't have time. The beauty routine happened at night. In the morning, you just maintained. You checked the edges, smoothed them down with a little more pomade if they'd lifted overnight. You tucked a few bobby pins into place. You made sure everything was neat, contained, professional. Because you knew that if you showed up to Mrs. Patterson's house with your hair looking unkempt, which was the word white women used when they meant black, you'd hear about it. Not directly. White women in 1956 didn't usually say things directly. But you'd hear it in the tone, in the slight pause before she said good morning, in the way she'd mention, casually, that she preferred when you wore your hair neat. So you kept it neat. Not for yourself, for survival. You left the house wearing a coat that was too thin for the Chicago winter, because a warm coat cost money you didn't have. You wore shoes that were comfortable enough to stand in all day but nice enough that you didn't look poor, because looking poor meant people treated you worse. You carried your lunch in a paper bag. A sandwich you'd made the night before, an apple if you had one. You didn't buy lunch. You couldn't afford to. The women you worked for, women who lived in houses with 6 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and kitchens bigger than your entire apartment, they didn't understand why you brought lunch. They'd offer you leftovers sometimes, in a way that was supposed to be generous but felt like pity. You took the leftovers. You brought them home to your children, and you never, ever let them see that it bothered you. Let's talk about what your body felt like. Your feet hurt. They always hurt. You stood all day, scrubbing floors, washing windows, ironing clothes, doing laundry by hand because Mrs. Patterson didn't trust you with her washing machine, even though you'd been cleaning her house for 3 years and had never broken anything. Your knees hurt from kneeling on hard floors. Your back hurt from bending over bathtubs, from reaching to dust-high shelves, from carrying baskets of wet laundry up from the basement. Your hands were dry, cracked, raw from bleach and ammonia and hot water and the harsh soaps that Mrs. Patterson insisted you use on everything. At night, you rubbed them with a mixture you made yourself. Petroleum jelly mixed with a few drops of glycerin, sometimes a little lanolin if you could get it. You'd rub it in until your hands were slick, then you'd put on a pair of cotton gloves and sleep in them. By morning, your hands would be soft again. Not completely healed. The cracks took weeks to heal, but soft enough that you could go another day. This was beauty care, but it was also medical care. Because if your hands cracked badly enough, they'd bleed. And if they bled, they'd get infected. And if they got infected, you couldn't work. And if you couldn't work, you didn't get paid. So you took care of your hands the same way you took care of everything else. With whatever you had, with knowledge passed down, with routines that didn't require a doctor or a prescription, or money you didn't have. Let's talk about Sunday. Because Sunday was different. On Sunday, you didn't go to Mrs. Patterson's house. On Sunday, you went to church. And on Sunday, you transformed. Saturday night was preparation. You washed your hair. You deep conditioned it with mayonnaise mixed with a raw egg and a little olive oil. You let it sit for an hour while you cleaned your kitchen, while you helped your children with their homework, while you listened to the radio. Then you rinsed it out with warm water, carefully, making sure you got all the egg out, because if you didn't, if any cooked egg stayed in your hair, it would smell for days. You set your hair in rollers, the pink foam ones or the wire mesh ones, or sometimes just strips of brown paper bag that you twisted sections of hair around and tied at the ends. You sat under a dryer if you had one, or you just let it air dry overnight. You slept in the rollers. It wasn't comfortable, but you were used to it. You'd been sleeping in rollers since you were a girl. You knew how to position your head so it didn't hurt too much. You knew how to tie your scarf so the rollers didn't fall out. Sunday morning you woke up early again. But this time, there was excitement. You took out the rollers carefully, one by one, watching your hair spring into perfect curls. You brushed through them gently, shaping them, arranging them, pinning them into the style you'd planned. You did your makeup. Not much. You didn't own much. You had one tube of lipstick, a deep red that you'd bought 2 years ago and rationed carefully, using just enough to define your lips, but not so much that you'd run out before you could afford another. You had a compact of pressed powder. You used it to set your face, to take away the shine, to even out your skin tone. You didn't have foundation. There was no foundation made for your skin tone in any store you could access. So you didn't wear it. You just made sure your skin was clean, moisturized, glowing on its own. You put on your Sunday dress. The one you kept wrapped in tissue paper in the closet. The one you only wore to church. The one you'd saved for 6 months to buy. You put on your hat, your gloves, your good shoes. And when you walked into church, you looked like royalty. Everyone did. The women in your church, women who worked as maids and cooks and laundresses and factory workers, women whose hands were raw and whose feet hurt and whose bodies were exhausted, they all looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Their hair was perfect. Their clothes were pressed. Their lipstick was exact. And they looked at each other with pride, with recognition, with respect, because they knew what it took. They knew that the woman sitting in the pew in front of you, the one with the elaborate hat and the perfectly waved hair, had probably stayed up until midnight getting ready, had probably spent her last dollar on that dress, had probably worked twice as hard as any white woman just to have half as much. But she was here, and she looked beautiful. And that mattered. It mattered because beauty, in that context, wasn't vanity. It was dignity. It was saying, you can make me scrub your floors, but you can't make me ugly. It was saying, I work hard, and I deserve to feel beautiful. It was saying, this is my community, and we have standards, and I'm going to meet them. After church, there was fellowship, there was food, there was talking and laughing, and children running around, and women standing in circles discussing everything from recipes to politics to who was sick and who needed help. And inevitably, someone would compliment your hair. Girl, who did your hair? I did it myself. You need to do mine next week. And maybe you would. Maybe you'd go to her house on Saturday afternoon and sit in her kitchen and do her hair while you talked. And maybe she'd pay you $5. Or maybe she'd trade you, doing your daughter's dress hem in exchange, or giving you some greens from her garden, or watching your children the next time you needed to work late. The beauty economy wasn't just commercial. It was relational. It was women helping women. It was skills traded. It was time given. It was knowledge shared. And it happened in kitchens that smelled like hair grease and coffee and whatever was cooking for dinner. It happened with children playing at your feet and the radio on in the background and someone's husband coming through asking when you'd be done. It happened in ordinary time, in ordinary spaces, with ordinary tools. But the results were extraordinary. Because the women who emerged from those kitchens looked polished, professional, put together. They looked like they'd been to a salon, even though the salon was someone's kitchen table. They looked like they'd spent money, even though they'd spent time instead. And they'd learned something, or taught something, or both. That was the daily reality. Not glamorous, not easy, not expensive, just consistent, just skilled, just passed down from one woman to another in an unbroken chain of care. Let's talk about one specific thing, the pressing comb. If you open your grandmother's drawer right now, or your great-aunt's closet, or a box in your mother's attic, you might still find one. Heavy, metal, with a wooden handle that's smooth from years of use. Maybe it's rusty now. Maybe it's been sitting in that drawer for 40 years, untouched, forgotten, replaced by flat irons and blow dryers and chemical relaxers. But there was a time when that comb was the most important beauty tool in the house. In the 1950s, the pressing comb was everywhere. Not in white homes. White women didn't need them. Their hair was already straight, or close enough that a regular curling iron could handle it. But in black homes, the pressing comb was essential. It sat on the stove, always. You heated it directly on the burner, watching the metal slowly change color, waiting for it to get hot enough to work but not so hot that it would burn. There was no temperature dial, no automatic shutoff, no safety features. You tested it on a piece of newspaper, or a cloth, or sometimes just by holding your hand near it and feeling the heat radiating off. If the paper singed, it was too hot. You'd set it aside, let it cool for 30 seconds. Test it again. If it didn't singe, if it just browned the paper slightly, it was ready. Then you'd section the hair, carefully, small sections, because if you tried to press too much hair at once, it wouldn't work. The middle wouldn't get hot enough, the outside would burn. You'd apply grease first. Always. Thick grease, the kind that came in a tin and smelled like bergamot or coconut, or sometimes just like petroleum and hope. You'd rub it between your palms, warm it up, then run it through the section of hair you were about to press. The grease served two purposes. One, it protected the hair from the direct heat. It created a barrier so the metal didn't just scorch the strands into brittleness. Two, it helped the press last longer. It sealed the hair in its straightened state, at least until humidity or sweat or time brought the curl back. Then you'd take the hot comb and pull it through, slowly, steadily, from root to tip. You had to be careful. Too much pressure and you'd pull the hair out. Too little and it wouldn't straighten. Too close to the scalp and you'd burn skin. Too far away and the roots would still be curly and the whole style would look unfinished. You had to know what you were doing. And most women did, because they'd been watching their mothers do this since they were children. They'd been sitting in chairs, heads tilted, feeling the heat near their ears, smelling the specific scent of hair grease meeting hot metal, hearing the sizzle when the comb passed through. That sound, that sizzle, it meant it was working. It was the sound of transformation, of curl becoming straight, of texture changing, temporarily, into something more manageable, more versatile, more aligned with the styles of the time. But it was also the sound of danger, because if you heard a louder sizzle, a sharper one, it meant the comb was too hot. It meant you were about to damage the hair, or worse, burn the scalp. And burns happened. Every black woman who grew up in the 1950s has a story about getting burned. Maybe it was an accident. The comb slipped. Your mother sneezed. You moved your head at the wrong time. Or maybe it was just inevitable. You can't heat a piece of metal to 400 degrees and wave it around someone's head without occasionally making contact with skin. The burns hurt. They left marks, small scars along the hairline, behind the ears, at the nape of the neck. But you didn't complain. Because complaining meant you were tender-headed. It meant you couldn't sit still. It meant you were making it harder on the person doing your hair, and they were already doing you a favor, already spending hours on you when they had 100 other things to do. So you sat still. You held your ear down when told. You tilted your head at the exact angle required. You breathed through the pain. And when it was done, when every section had been pressed and the comb had been set back on the stove to cool, you looked in the mirror and saw straight hair. Hair that swung, hair that moved, hair that you could run your fingers through without them getting caught in curls. It felt like freedom. Not freedom from blackness, not freedom from yourself, freedom to choose, freedom to style. Freedom to look different on Tuesday than you did on Sunday. The pressing comb gave you options. You could press your hair straight and then curl it with regular curlers, creating the kinds of soft waves and victory rolls that were fashionable in the 1950s. You could press it and pin it up into an elegant bun. You could press it and braid it, creating a sleek, flat look that stayed in place all week. Or you could skip the pressing comb entirely and work with your natural texture, braiding it or twisting it or picking it out. The point is, you could choose. And the pressing comb was one of the tools that made that choice possible. But it was more than a tool. It became a symbol. For some people, the pressing comb symbolized assimilation. It symbolized the pressure to look white, to erase blackness, to conform to European beauty standards. And there's truth in that. The social pressure to straighten hair was real. The message that natural black hair was unacceptable was everywhere. But for other people, the pressing comb symbolized skill. It symbolized the intimacy between mothers and daughters, between sisters, between friends. It symbolized Saturday afternoons in the kitchen. It symbolized the smell of hair grease and the sound of gospel music on the radio, and the feel of hands working through your hair, section by section, with patience and care. It symbolized a ritual, and rituals matter. They create continuity. They mark time. They connect generations. A woman pressing her daughter's hair in 1956 was doing exactly what her mother had done to her in 1936, and what her grandmother had done in 1916. The tool had evolved, the technique had refined, but the core act, the mother caring for the daughter's hair, preparing her to face the world, teaching her how to care for herself, that hadn't changed. And when that daughter grew up and had her own daughter, she would do the same thing. Until she didn't. Because by the 1970s, the pressing comb started to disappear. Chemical relaxers became more common, more accessible, less likely to cause immediate burns. Women started choosing permanent straightening over the weekly ritual of heat pressing. And then, in the opposite direction, the natural hair movement started gaining strength. Women started rejecting straightening altogether, wearing afros, wearing lokes, wearing their hair in its natural state. The pressing comb became old-fashioned, a relic, something grandmothers used. And eventually, it was packed away in drawers and forgotten. But the women who used them, who knew how to heat them just right, who knew the exact angle and pressure required, who knew how to press a whole head of hair without causing a single burn, those women were artists. They were craftspeople working with one of the most difficult canvases there is, human hair, alive and growing and responding to everything, to weather and hormones and stress and diet and treatment. And they made it beautiful. Not with expensive products, not with fancy salons, not with professional training, with a metal comb, and heat, and knowledge passed down through generations. That's worth remembering. Because we've replaced the pressing comb with flat irons that cost $200 and have digital temperature controls and ceramic plates and automatic shutoffs. And those are easier, safer, more convenient. But they don't require the same skill. They don't require you to learn from someone who knows. They don't require you to pay attention, to develop a feel for it, to understand the relationship between heat and hair and time. You just plug them in and use them. And in gaining convenience, we lost something. We lost the ritual. We lost the transmission of knowledge. We lost the hours spent in the kitchen with your mother's hands in your hair, learning not just how to press hair, but how to be patient, how to sit still, how to trust someone else to care for you. The pressing comb wasn't just about hair. It was about relationship. And when we put it away, when we replaced it with something easier, we didn't just change our hair care routine. We changed how knowledge moved between generations. We changed what mothers taught daughters. We changed what it meant to get ready. And maybe that's progress. Maybe it's good that we don't have to spend 3 hours every Saturday doing hair. But maybe it's also loss. Maybe both things are true at once. Not every black woman in the 1950s had the same experience. We need to say that clearly, because when we talk about history, especially black history, there's a tendency to flatten it. To talk about black women as if they were all the same, as if they all lived the same lives, faced the same challenges, had access to the same resources. But that was never true. There were class divisions. There were regional divisions. There were colorism divisions. There were educational divisions. And all of those divisions affected beauty practices. Let's start with class. If you were a middle-class black woman in 1950s America, and there were some, not many, but some, your beauty routine looked different. You probably didn't clean white women's houses. You probably worked as a teacher, or a nurse, or a secretary in a black-owned business. Or maybe you didn't work at all because your husband made enough money to support the family. You had more time. You had more money. You could afford to go to a professional beauty salon, not just someone's kitchen. You could afford to buy brand-name products instead of making your own. You could afford multiple outfits, multiple pairs of shoes, multiple lipsticks in different shades. And your beauty standards were different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just different. You might have been more likely to chemically straighten your hair because you could afford the salon treatments that did it safely. You might have been more likely to follow mainstream fashion trends because you had access to the magazines, to the stores that sold those clothes, to the social circles where those trends mattered. You might have been more concerned with looking respectable, looking educated, looking like you belonged in middle-class spaces. And looking respectable in 1950s America had very specific requirements. It meant looking neat, conservative, professional. It meant hair that was controlled, styled, never wild. It meant makeup that was subtle, never too bright, never too bold. It meant dressing in a way that white people would find non-threatening, because even middle-class black women had to navigate white spaces, had to work with white people, had to prove, constantly, that they deserved to be there. And beauty was part of that proof. If you showed up to your teaching job with your hair in braids, in 1956, you might lose that job. If you showed up with an afro, which wasn't even a mainstream style yet, you definitely would lose that job. So you straightened your hair. You wore it in conservative styles. You dressed conservatively. You wore minimal makeup. Not because you hated yourself, but because you understood the game. You understood that as a black woman, you were being judged more harshly than anyone else. You were being watched. And if you wanted to keep your job, keep your status, keep your access to middle-class life, you had to play by rules that were designed to exclude you in the first place. Now let's talk about working-class black women. The women we've been talking about mostly. The domestic workers, the factory workers, the women who cleaned and cooked and laundered for other people. Your beauty routine was limited by time and money. You couldn't spend 2 hours in a salon every week. You couldn't afford professional chemical treatments. You couldn't buy expensive products. So you did it yourself. You used what you had. You learned from the women around you. And your beauty standards were different too. You cared about looking good on Sunday. You cared about being clean, being neat, being presentable. But you didn't have the luxury of worrying about looking threatening or non-threatening to white people in professional settings, because you weren't in professional settings. You were in white people's kitchens. You were in white people's laundry rooms. You were invisible to them except as a worker. So your beauty wasn't for them. It was for you, for your community, for the people who actually saw you as a person. And that created freedom, in a strange way. Freedom to experiment, freedom to use bright lipstick if you wanted, freedom to style your hair in ways that were distinctly black, because you weren't trying to blend into white professional spaces, but it also meant you had less protection. Because if a middle-class black woman faced discrimination, she might have some recourse, she might have connections, she might have a husband with status, or a family with lawyers, or some small amount of social capital. If you were a working-class black woman, you had nothing. If you lost your job, you lost everything. So you had to be careful too, just in different ways. Now let's talk about skin tone. Because we can't talk about black beauty in the 1950s without talking about colorism. The preference for lighter skin over darker skin was pervasive. It was cruel. It was a direct result of slavery, of centuries of white people raping enslaved black women and then treating the lighter-skinned children as slightly more valuable than the darker-skinned ones. By the 1950s, this had created a hierarchy within black communities. Lighter-skinned black women had more opportunities. They were more likely to be hired for certain jobs. They were more likely to marry into middle-class families. They were considered more beautiful by mainstream standards. And the beauty industry reinforced this. Skin bleaching creams were advertised in black magazines, advertised aggressively, with promises that lighter skin would make you more attractive, more successful, more desirable. These products were dangerous. They contained mercury, hydroquinone, other chemicals that damaged skin, caused scarring, caused long-term health problems. But women used them anyway. Not because they were stupid, not because they hated being black, but because the world had told them, explicitly and repeatedly, that darker skin was worth less, that if you were dark-skinned, you had to work twice as hard to be seen as beautiful, that you had to compensate with perfect hair, perfect clothes, perfect manners, that you were already starting from behind, and you had to do everything possible to catch up. This was trauma. This was internalized racism. This was the poison of white supremacy working its way into black communities, into black families, into black women's relationships with their own bodies. And it created divisions. Light-skinned women were resented. Dark-skinned women were pitied or dismissed. There were social clubs that wouldn't accept you if your skin was too dark. There were families where darker-skinned children were treated worse than lighter-skinned ones. It was horrible. And beauty practices got caught up in it. If you were dark-skinned, you might have been told that you needed to be extra careful with your appearance, that you couldn't afford to look sloppy, or unkempt, or anything less than perfect. You might have been told to avoid certain colors, to avoid bright lipstick because it would make you look too dark, to avoid certain hairstyles because they would draw attention to your blackness. You might have been told, directly or indirectly, that you needed to compensate for your skin tone with everything else. And some women internalized that. Some women spent their whole lives trying to be lighter, trying to minimize their darkness, trying to fit a standard that was designed to exclude them. But other women rejected it. Other women said, "I'm dark-skinned and I'm beautiful. I'm going to wear red lipstick. I'm going to wear my hair natural. I'm going to take up space." And those women, in the 1950s, were radicals. They were fighting against not just white beauty standards, but black beauty standards. They were fighting against their own families, their own communities, their own internalized beliefs, and they often paid a price for it. They were called difficult. They were called ugly. They were told they'd never find a husband. They were excluded from social circles. But they persisted, and they laid the groundwork for the natural hair movement that would come later, for the Black is Beautiful movement, for the eventual reclamation of dark skin as beautiful, as powerful, as worthy. But in the 1950s, that was still far away. In the 1950s, colorism was at its peak, and beauty routines reflected that. The divide between light and dark, between middle class and working class, between respectable and ordinary, all of those divides shaped what women did with their hair, their skin, their appearance. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there was no single black beauty experience. There were many, and they were shaped by power, by class, by color, by region, by access. But underneath all of those divisions, there was still shared knowledge. There were still techniques that moved across class lines. There were still grandmothers teaching granddaughters, regardless of whether they were light or dark, rich or poor. There were still kitchens where women gathered and did each other's hair and shared what they knew. The divisions were real, but the connections were real too. And that's what we have to hold on to. The knowledge survived because women kept sharing it, even across divides, even when they weren't supposed to. Because beauty knowledge, at its core, was about survival. And survival didn't care about class. It didn't care about skin tone. It just cared about getting through another day with your dignity intact. Now we need to break something wide open. Something you've probably believed your whole life. Something that's been repeated so many times it feels like fact. Something that's been used to judge black women, to criticize them, to pathologize their relationship with their own hair. Here it is. The idea that black women straightened their hair because they wanted to be white. That's the story we've been told. That's the narrative that dominates every conversation about black hair in the 20th century. That straightening equals self-hatred. That pressing combs and relaxers were tools of assimilation. That every black woman who didn't wear her hair natural was suffering from internalized racism. And here's the truth. That's too simple. It's not completely wrong, but it's so incomplete that it borders on a lie. Let me show you why. First, hair straightening among black women predates significant contact with white beauty standards. Go back to Africa. Multiple African cultures used heat and tools to temporarily alter hair texture, not to look European. Europeans weren't even part of the equation. They did it for style, for variety, for ritual purposes, for the same reason humans everywhere have always decorated and modified their bodies. Hair was art, hair was communication, and changing your hair texture was one way to expand the artistic possibilities. When enslaved Africans arrived in America, they didn't forget this. They didn't suddenly develop a desire to look white. What they lost was access to the tools, the time, the community structures that had supported elaborate hair care. So they adapted. They used what was available. They simplified. They developed new techniques based on old knowledge and new constraints. And yes, over time, as white supremacy became more entrenched, as black people were told again and again that their natural features were inferior, some of those hair practices did become tied to assimilation, to trying to fit in, to trying to access opportunities that were denied to people who looked too black. But that's not the whole story. It's not even most of the story. Here's what actually happened. By the 1950s, most black women straightened their hair sometimes. Not all the time, not permanently, but sometimes. And they did it for dozens of different reasons. Some did it because it made their hair easier to manage in a climate that was humid and hot. Some did it because they liked how it looked, because they thought they looked pretty with straight hair. Not white, pretty. Some did it because it gave them more styling options, because you can't set pin curls in very tight coils, because certain fashionable styles of the era required straighter hair to execute. Some did it because their jobs required it. Because white employers demanded it. Because showing up with natural hair could get you fired. Some did it because their mothers did it, and their grandmothers did it, and it was just what you did on Saturday night before church on Sunday. Some did it because they were experimenting, because they wanted to see what they'd look like, because humans like to play with their appearance. And here's the critical part. Many of these same women also wore their hair natural sometimes. They'd press it for church on Sunday, then wash it out on Monday and braid it for the rest of the week. They'd wear it straight for work, then wear it in twists at home. They'd experiment with both. They'd move between styles. They'd make different choices depending on context, on mood, on what they felt like doing. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't self-hatred. This was versatility. This was having a full range of options and using all of them. But here's what happened in the historical record. White observers and later some black critics during the natural hair movement of the 1960s and 70s saw black women straightening their hair and made an assumption. They assumed it was about whiteness. They assumed it was about shame. They assumed it was pathological. And that assumption stuck. It became the dominant narrative. It became what everyone believed. It became the lens through which all black hair practices were interpreted. And it erased the actual complexity of what black women were doing and why. Let me give you a specific example. There's a famous photograph from the 1950s. A black woman sitting in a beauty salon, getting her hair pressed. The photograph has been used in countless textbooks, articles, documentaries about black beauty culture. And almost every time it's used, the caption is something like, "Black women straightening their hair to conform to white beauty standards." But here's what the caption never mentions. That woman was getting her hair pressed so she could then set it in curls. The final style she was going for wasn't straight hair, it was curled hair. Specifically, it was a style called finger waves, which required the hair to be straightened first so it could then be molded into deep, sculpted waves. The final look was distinctly black. It was a style that was popular in black communities, that black women had developed and refined, that had nothing to do with trying to look white. But the photograph only captured the middle of the process, the straightening part. And so that's what got remembered. That's what got interpreted. That's what became the story. Black women straightening their hair to look white. When the reality was, black women straightening their hair so they could create a specifically black style that was fashionable in their community at that moment. Do you see the difference? Do you see how the narrative got flattened, got simplified, got turned into something that blamed black women for their own oppression? Here's another piece. The natural hair movement of the 1960s and 70s, which was beautiful and radical and important, also created a new kind of judgment. It said that wearing your hair natural was politically conscious. It was black pride. It was authentic. And by implication, straightening your hair was politically unconscious. It was self-hatred. It was inauthentic. This created enormous pressure. Suddenly, your hair wasn't just your hair. It was a political statement. It was a measure of your blackness. It was something that could be judged, criticized, used to determine whether you were really down for the cause or whether you were still trapped in white supremacist beauty standards. And that was unfair. Because a woman who straightened her hair in 1968 might have been doing it for the exact same reason a woman straightened her hair in 1958. Because she liked it. Because it was easier. Because it was what she knew. Her consciousness hadn't changed. Her politics hadn't changed. Her hair had just always been part of her routine. But now she was being told that her routine was wrong, that she needed to change, that her hair was a betrayal of her race. And some women did change. They stopped straightening. They wore afros. They embraced natural hair. But some women didn't, and they shouldn't have had to. Because here's the actual truth, the one we need to sit with. Hair is just hair. It can carry meaning. It can be political. It can be symbolic. But it doesn't have to be. Sometimes a woman straightens her hair because she wants to, and that's enough. Sometimes a woman wears her hair natural because she wants to, and that's enough. Neither choice should require a justification. Neither choice should be subject to political analysis. Neither choice should determine her worth, her blackness, her authenticity. But for black women in America, hair has never been allowed to be just hair. It's always been scrutinized, by white people, by other black people, by everyone. And that scrutiny is exhausting. So here's the misconception we're breaking. The misconception is that there's a right way and a wrong way to wear black hair. That natural is good and straightened is bad, or that straightened is respectable and natural is radical. The truth is that black women have always done 1,000 different things with their hair, for 1,000 different reasons, and most of those reasons had nothing to do with white people. They had to do with style, with tradition, with experimentation, with practicality, with personal preference. And the knowledge that allowed them to do all those things, the techniques for pressing and curling and braiding and twisting and loking, that knowledge was never about assimilation. It was about skill. It was about having options. It was about control over your own body in a world that tried very hard to take that control away. So when we look at a black woman in 1955 sitting in a kitchen getting her hair pressed, we need to ask different questions. Not, why is she trying to look white? But, what is she creating? What does she know? Who taught her? What will she do with her hair once it's pressed? What does this moment mean to her? Those are better questions. Those are questions that respect her humanity. Those are questions that might actually lead us to the truth. And the truth is complicated. It's messy. It doesn't fit into neat political categories. But it's real. And it's worth recovering. Because the women who knew these techniques, who practiced them, who passed them down, they weren't confused. They weren't damaged. They weren't betraying anyone. They were making choices with the options they had. And they were beautiful. All of them. In every style, with every choice. That's what we missed. That's what the simplified narrative erased. And that's what we need to get back. Now let's slow down. Let's move into the rhythm of it, the repetition. The way beauty wasn't an event but a cycle, a set of practices that happened the same way, at the same time, week after week, year after year, until they became invisible, until they became just what you did. Saturday was hair day. Not every Saturday for every woman. But for most, for many, Saturday was when you washed your hair, when you conditioned it, when you set it, when you prepared for Sunday. This wasn't arbitrary. This was structured around the rhythm of the week. Sunday was church. Sunday was community. Sunday was when you needed to look your best. So Saturday was preparation. You didn't wash your hair on Sunday morning. There wasn't time. You didn't wash it on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday because you were working, because you were tired, because those days belonged to someone else. Saturday was yours. Or at least, Saturday evening was. After the cleaning was done, after the cooking was done, after the children were fed and bathed and put to bed, then you'd fill a basin with warm water. You'd take down your hair from whatever style you'd been wearing all week. You'd section it, and you'd wash it. This was ritual, not in a spiritual sense necessarily, though for some women it was spiritual, but ritual in the sense that it happened the same way every time, in the same order, with the same movements. You started at the scalp. You worked the shampoo in with your fingertips, massaging, stimulating blood flow, working out the oil and dirt and sweat from the week. You rinsed. You repeated. Then you conditioned. Maybe with a store-bought conditioner if you could afford it. Maybe with mayonnaise mixed with egg and oil. Maybe with something your grandmother made that didn't have a name, just a method. You worked it through the length of your hair, section by section, making sure every strand was coated. Then you waited. This was the slow part, the sitting part. You'd wrap your hair in a towel, or a plastic cap if you had one, and you'd sit, for 30 minutes, for an hour, for however long it took. And while you sat, you did other things. You ironed clothes for the next day. You prepared Sunday dinner so it would be easier in the morning. You read. You listened to the radio. You talked to your children, your husband, whoever else was home. The beauty routine wasn't separate from life. It was woven into it. It happened in the margins, in the in-between times, while you were doing something else. Then you'd rinse out the conditioner. You'd towel dry your hair, and you'd start setting it. This part took the longest. If you were using rollers, you'd section the hair into small pieces, comb each piece smooth, apply setting lotion if you had it, and roll it onto the roller, pinning it in place. This could take an hour, sometimes more. Your arms would get tired. Your neck would hurt from tilting your head at odd angles. But you kept going, because this was what you did, because the result was worth it. If you were using pin curls instead of rollers, you'd twist each section of hair into a small coil and pin it flat against your head. If you were braiding it, you'd braid it wet and let it dry overnight, then unbraid it in the morning for a crimped, textured look. Whatever method you used, the principle was the same. You were setting the hair while it was wet, shaping it into the form you wanted, and letting it dry in that shape. Then you'd tie it down, cover it with a scarf, and you'd sleep. Sleeping in rollers was uncomfortable. The pins dug into your scalp. You couldn't rest your head normally. You had to sleep on your side, or on your stomach, or propped up in a way that didn't flatten the curls. But you did it, because you'd been doing it since you were a girl, because your mother had done it, because this was part of the rhythm. Sunday morning you'd wake up early. You'd take down the rollers one by one, or unwrap the scarf and unbraid the braids. And your hair would spring into perfect curls, perfect waves, perfect shape. Then you'd style it. This was the creative part, the part where skill really showed. You'd brush through the curls gently, shaping them, arranging them, pinning them into place. You'd use pomade to smooth the edges, to add shine, to keep everything in place. You'd use bobby pins, hairpins, combs to create the exact silhouette you wanted. And when you were done, when you looked in the mirror, you'd see the result of the entire process. Hours of work, condensed into a style that looked effortless. That was the goal. To look like you hadn't tried. To look like you just woke up beautiful. Even though everyone knew the truth. Everyone knew how much work it took. But that was part of the performance. Part of the ritual. You didn't complain about the work. You didn't talk about the hours. You just showed up looking perfect. And everyone else did the same. This created a community standard. A shared understanding that beauty required effort, that it required time, that it required knowledge. And because everyone was putting in the same effort, there was respect. You respected the woman whose hair was laid perfectly because you knew what it took. You knew she'd spent Saturday night in rollers. You knew she'd woken up early. You knew she'd used skills that had been passed down through generations. And she respected you for the same reasons. This was the rhythm. Wash, condition, set, sleep, style. Every week. For years. For decades. Until it became muscle memory. Until you could do it half asleep. Until you could set your own hair in the dark. And it wasn't just hair. The same rhythm applied to skin care. Every night, you washed your face, you moisturized, you protected. Every morning, you did it again. This wasn't negotiable. This wasn't something you skipped when you were tired. This was maintenance. This was survival. Because if you didn't moisturize, your skin would dry out. It would crack. It would age faster. If you didn't cleanse, dirt and oil would build up. Your skin would break out. You'd look tired, dull, older than you were. So you did it. Every single day. And the products you used were simple. Cold cream to cleanse. Petroleum jelly to moisturize. Maybe a little rose water as toner if you were fancy. That was it. 3 products. Used consistently. Used correctly. used every day without fail, and the results were better than anything you could buy now. Because consistency matters more than complexity. Because simple routines, done daily, work better than elaborate routines done occasionally. Because your skin doesn't need 12 products. It needs 3 products used religiously for 50 years. The women who understood this, who practiced this, who made beauty care a non-negotiable part of their daily rhythm, they aged beautifully. They had skin that glowed at 70, hair that was thick at 80, bodies that were cared for, maintained, respected. Not because they had money, not because they had access to expensive treatments, but because they had discipline, they had routine. They had ritual. And ritual, when it's practiced long enough, becomes identity. It becomes who you are. You're not a woman who sometimes takes care of her hair. You're a woman who sets her hair every Saturday night. That's part of your identity. You're not a woman who occasionally moisturizes. You're a woman who never goes to bed with a dry face. That's who you are. And that identity, that sense of self, built on consistent practice, that was powerful. It meant you couldn't be shaken. You couldn't be made to feel less than, because you knew who you were, you knew what you did, you knew the work you put in, and no one could take that from you. That's what ritual gives you. Not just good hair or clear skin, but certainty, identity, dignity, the knowledge that you're taking care of yourself, consistently, with skill, with knowledge passed down through generations, that you're part of a lineage, that what you're doing matters. Not because the world sees it, not because anyone's taking photographs or writing articles, but because you see it, because you know, and that's enough. We need to talk about what all of this cost. Not in money, though it cost that too, but in body, in pain, in the physical toll of maintaining beauty standards while also just trying to survive. Let's start with hands. If you were a domestic worker in the 1950s, your hands were in water all day. Hot water, cold water, water mixed with bleach, with ammonia, with harsh soaps designed to strip grease and dirt from dishes, from floors, from other people's clothes. Your hands were raw. The skin would crack, especially in winter. The cracks would split deep enough to bleed. Deep enough that they'd catch on fabric when you were folding laundry. Deep enough that you'd wince every time you had to put them back in water. But you had to put them back in water, because that was your job. So you managed it. You rubbed petroleum jelly into the cracks at night. You wore cotton gloves to bed. You tried to wear rubber gloves while you worked, if your employer allowed it, if you could afford them, if they didn't make your hands sweat so badly that they cracked anyway. And you kept working. Because stopping wasn't an option. Because if you couldn't work, you couldn't eat. Your beauty routine, your hand care, wasn't vanity. It was medical necessity. It was the difference between being able to work and not being able to work. Now let's talk about feet. You stood all day, on hard floors, in shoes that weren't designed for standing, in shoes that were cheap because that's what you could afford, or in shoes that used to be nice but were now worn down, the support gone, the soles thin. Your feet hurt constantly. They developed calluses, corns, bunions from shoes that didn't fit right, plantar fasciitis from arches that had collapsed under years of standing. At night, you'd soak them if you had time, in warm water with Epsom salts if you could get them. You'd rub them with lotion. You'd try to massage out the knots. But in the morning, you'd put those same shoes back on and stand for another 8 hours. And the pain was just part of life, part of the cost of working, part of the cost of surviving. Your body was a tool. You used it to make money, and tools wear out. But you were also a woman, and women were expected to be beautiful. So somehow, with feet that hurt, and hands that were cracked, and a body that was exhausted, you still had to show up on Sunday looking perfect. That required strategy. You saved your good shoes for church, the ones that fit properly, the ones that didn't hurt as much. You wore them only on Sunday, for a few hours, then you took them off and put them away until next week. The rest of the week, you wore the cheap shoes, the worn-out shoes, the shoes that hurt, because you couldn't afford to wear out your good shoes, because those good shoes had to last for years. This was the calculus of survival. Everything was rationed, everything was preserved, Everything had to last as long as possible. Your good dress, your good shoes, your lipstick, your perfume. You used them sparingly. You made them last. And the rest of the time, you made do. Let's talk about hair breakage. If you pressed your hair with a hot comb every week for years, some of your hair would break. Not all of it. Not if you were careful. But some. The heat was damaging. There was no way around that. No matter how skilled you were, no matter how much grease you used, repeated heat exposure weakened the hair shaft. And if you were using chemical relaxers, the damage was worse. Relaxers worked by breaking down the protein bonds in hair. Permanently. Irreversibly. If you applied them correctly, if you rinsed them out at exactly the right time, if you conditioned deeply afterward, you could minimize the damage. But if you left them on too long, if you overlapped the chemicals onto previously relaxed hair, if you didn't condition enough, your hair would break. It would snap off at the roots. It would thin. It would become so weak that even gentle combing would pull it out. And you'd have to cut it, start over, grow it back. This happened to women all the time. Not because they were careless. Not because they didn't know what they were doing. But because the chemicals were harsh. Because the margin for error was tiny. Because sometimes you were doing your own hair at home, late at night, exhausted from work, and you miscalculated. Or because you went to someone who said they knew what they were doing, and they didn't, and your hair paid the price. But here's what you did. You didn't panic. You didn't stop caring for yourself. You cut the damaged hair. You started a deep conditioning routine. You gave your hair a break from chemicals, from heat, from manipulation. You wore it braided for a while, or wrapped in a scarf, or in a simple, protective style. And you waited for it to grow back. Because it would grow back. It always did. And while you waited, you learned. You learned not to trust that person again. You learned to be more careful with the timing. You learned which products were too harsh. You learned to listen to your hair, to your scalp, to the signals your body was giving you. Pain was a teacher. Not a good teacher. Not a kind teacher. But a teacher nonetheless. Every burn taught you something. Every broken strand taught you something. Every mistake taught you something. And you passed that knowledge on. You told your daughter, don't leave the relaxer on for more than 20 minutes. Don't let it touch your scalp. Test the heat of the comb first. You told her what you'd learned, what had hurt you, what you'd figured out. So maybe she wouldn't have to learn the same way. Let's talk about exhaustion. Because beauty routines took time. Hours and hours every week. Time you didn't really have. Time you stole from sleep, from rest, from sitting down after a long day. Saturday night, after working all day, after cooking dinner, after cleaning the kitchen, after bathing the children and putting them to bed, you still had to do your hair. And it would take 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes more. So you stayed up late. You sacrificed sleep. Because Sunday was important. Because looking good was important. Because your community expected it and you expected it of yourself. But you were tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that settles into your body and doesn't leave. The kind of tired that comes from working 6 days a week, from standing all day, from lifting and scrubbing and carrying. And then you added beauty maintenance on top of that. It wasn't sustainable, not really. But you sustained it anyway. Because you had to. Because stopping, giving up, letting yourself go, that felt like surrender. And you weren't ready to surrender. So you kept going. You kept washing and conditioning and setting and styling. Even when you were exhausted, even when your body hurt, even when you wanted nothing more than to just lie down and not move, you kept going. That's survival. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that gets talked about in history books. The quiet kind. The daily kind. The kind that requires you to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when everything hurts. Let's talk about pregnancy and childbirth. Because your body didn't stop being a body just because you were trying to survive. You got pregnant. You carried babies. You gave birth. And during all of that, you were still expected to work, to maintain your appearance, to keep going. There was no maternity leave, not for domestic workers, not for most black women. You worked until you couldn't anymore. Until labor started, until you physically had to stop. And then, a week later, maybe 2 if you were lucky, you went back to work. Because you needed the money, because your job wouldn't wait. Because there were other women who would take your place if you didn't come back. Your body hadn't recovered. You were still bleeding. Your breasts were engorged with milk. You were exhausted in a way that's hard to describe. But you went back to work. And you still did your hair. You still took care of your skin. You still showed up on Sunday looking put together. Because that was expected. Because that was who you were. And somehow your body survived it. Not unscathed. Not without cost. But it survived. Women's bodies are stronger than they should have to be. That's not a celebration. That's a tragedy. Because women, black women especially, shouldn't have had to be that strong. They shouldn't have had to work through pain, through exhaustion, through recovery from childbirth. They shouldn't have had to maintain beauty standards while their hands were bleeding and their feet were swollen and their bodies were breaking down. But they did. Because they had no choice. And the beauty routines, the care routines, the rituals we've been talking about, they weren't separate from that survival. They were part of it. Taking care of your skin wasn't vanity. It was preventing infection in those cracks on your hands. Taking care of your hair wasn't frivolous. It was maintaining your dignity in a world that tried to strip it from you. Looking good on Sunday wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about proving to yourself that you were still here, still standing, still human. That's what the beauty routines meant. They were acts of resistance against a world that wanted to work you to death and pretend you didn't matter. They were ways of saying, I matter. I'm worth caring for. I deserve to feel beautiful even if everything hurts. And they were passed down, these routines, not as punishment, not as impossible standards, but as survival tools. Your grandmother taught you to moisturize every night because she knew what happened to skin that wasn't cared for. She taught you to wrap your hair because she knew what happened to hair that was neglected. She taught you these things because she loved you, because she wanted you to survive, because she wanted you to have something that was yours, something you could control, in a world that tried to control everything about you. The beauty secrets weren't secrets. They were survival strategies. Passed down through generations of women who understood that caring for your body, maintaining your dignity, looking in the mirror and seeing someone worthy, that was how you survived. Not physically. You could survive physically without any of it, but spiritually, emotionally, as a whole person. That's what the routines protected. Not your hair, not your skin, your sense of self, your humanity. And in a world that tried to take both of those things away, that was everything. Something started shifting in the late 1950s. Not all at once, not dramatically, not the way it gets described in textbooks, where there's a before and an after and a clear line between them. It was slower than that, more complicated than that, more human than that. But something was changing. The world that had contained black women's beauty practices, the world of segregated neighborhoods and informal economies and kitchen salons and grandmother recipes, that world was being pressed on from every direction at once. And it would never be exactly the same again. Let's start with the most visible change. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. And the Montgomery bus boycott began. And for 381 days, black residents of Montgomery walked to work, carpooled, stayed home, did anything except ride those buses. That boycott worked. The buses desegregated. And something else happened too. The boycott was organized, in part, through black churches and black social organizations and black beauty shops. Yes, beauty shops. The women who ran those shops, and the women who came to them every week, were part of the network that kept the boycott organized. They passed information. They coordinated rides. They fundraised. They kept each other motivated through months of walking in Alabama heat. The beauty shop, that informal space that had always been about more than hair, became explicitly political. It had always been political, but now it was openly, actively, necessarily political. And this changed how black women thought about their appearance. Because if you were going to march, if you were going to sit at a lunch counter and refuse to leave, if you were going to stand in front of a white police officer who was about to hit you with a baton, how did you want to look? This was a real question that civil rights activists discussed, and the answer, for most of them, was dignified. They wanted to look dignified. They wanted to wear their best clothes to demonstrations. They wanted their hair to be neat, they wanted their shoes to be polished. Not because they were trying to impress white people, but because looking dignified was a statement. It said, "We are not what you think we are. We are not animals, we are not inferior. We are human beings who deserve to be treated as such." And the preparation that went into that, the careful grooming, the pressed clothes, the neat hair, was deeply intentional. It was the Saturday night beauty routine now carrying the weight of a political movement. But at the same time, and this is where it gets interesting, another conversation was starting. A conversation that would eventually explode in the 1960s. A conversation about what black beauty should look like, what it should mean. Whether trying to look dignified in ways that white people would recognize as dignified was actually a form of surrender. This conversation was quiet in the late 1950s, almost underground, but it was happening. In certain college dormitories, in certain jazz clubs, in the circles around artists and writers and musicians who were starting to question everything. And the question they were asking, about hair, about skin, about beauty, was this: why are we trying to meet their standards at all? Now let's talk about something else that was changing: television. By the mid-1950s, television sets were appearing in more and more homes, and television was showing black Americans something they'd rarely seen before: themselves. Not often, not fully, not without distortion, but occasionally, a black face appeared on television. Nat King Cole had a variety show that ran briefly. Performers appeared on Ed Sullivan. Athletes were visible. And black women saw those images and thought about what they meant. They saw how black women were presented on television, when they were presented at all. They saw that the women who appeared were usually light-skinned, usually had straightened hair, usually conformed to a very specific kind of beauty. And some women looked at those images and felt confirmed in their existing practices. And some women looked at those images and felt erased, because their faces weren't there, their hair wasn't there, their skin tone wasn't there. Television didn't just reflect culture, it shaped it. And in the late 1950s, it was shaping black beauty culture in ways that were just beginning to be felt. Now let's talk about money. The post-war economic boom had lifted some black families into the middle class. Not many. The gains were real but unequal. Discrimination in housing, in hiring, in lending, made sure that black Americans couldn't fully participate in the prosperity that white Americans were enjoying. But some families had more money than they'd had before, and that money changed beauty practices. Because when you have more money, you buy more products. And the beauty industry noticed. White-owned companies, which had largely ignored black consumers for decades, started paying attention. Not because they cared about black women, because they saw a market, and they started making products, or marketing existing products, specifically toward black consumers. The advertisements appeared in Ebony magazine, which had launched in 1945 and was reaching hundreds of thousands of black readers by the late 1950s. These advertisements were sophisticated. They used black models. They used language that spoke directly to black women's experiences. But they were also selling something beyond the product. They were selling aspiration. They were selling the idea that buying a certain cream, a certain shampoo, a certain lipstick would make you more beautiful, more successful, more worthy. And this was the same lie that white beauty advertising had always told, just now directed at black women. And it worked, because aspiration works. Because everyone wants to believe that the right product will change their life. So black women started buying more products, more variety, more of the commercial beauty system. And gradually, the kitchen recipes started to seem old-fashioned. Why make your own hair grease when you could buy Posner's bergamot? Why deep condition with mayonnaise when you could buy a product from a bottle? This wasn't a sudden shift. It happened slowly, over years, but it was happening. The knowledge was starting to fade. Not disappear, but fade. Grandmothers were still making their recipes, still teaching their granddaughters, still insisting on the old methods. But the granddaughters were looking at magazine advertisements and wondering if there was something better, something more modern, something that didn't require them to spend Saturday in the kitchen making hair grease. And sometimes there was. Sometimes the commercial products were genuinely better. But often they weren't. Often they were just packaged more attractively, sold more aggressively, and validated by the authority of science and advertising in a way that kitchen recipes never were. Now let's talk about what was happening physically. The Great Migration had been moving Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North and West for decades. By the late 1950s, millions of Black families had made that move. And migration changed beauty practices in specific ways. In the rural South, certain plants were available, certain traditions were maintained more easily because communities were stable, because grandmothers and granddaughters lived near each other, because the knowledge network was intact. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in New York, things were different. You couldn't grow aloe vera in a Chicago apartment building in January. You couldn't find certain herbs at the grocery store. You couldn't get certain oils that people in your grandmother's community had always had access to. So you substituted, you adapted. You found commercial alternatives for the natural ingredients you'd been using. And some of those substitutions worked, and some of them didn't. And the original recipes, the ones that called for specific plants in specific amounts, started to get modified, simplified, until sometimes they were barely recognizable, and the knowledge degraded. Not intentionally, not because anyone stopped caring, but because the environment changed, because the ingredients changed, because the community structures that had transmitted the knowledge changed. Migration didn't destroy Black beauty knowledge, but it transformed it. It made it more urban, more commercial, more dependent on products you could buy rather than ingredients you could grow. And by the end of the 1950s, this transformation was well underway. The kitchen hadn't disappeared. Grandmothers were still teaching. Saturday routines were still happening. But they were already beginning to be mixed with commercial products, with new techniques, with influences from a wider, more connected world. And in the decade that followed, in the 1960s, everything would accelerate. The civil rights movement would become the Black Power movement. The natural hair movement would emerge. Chemical relaxers would become more sophisticated and more widely used. Television would expand. Advertising would intensify. The world around Black women's beauty practices would change so dramatically that many of the old methods would get buried under layers of new information, new products, new politics. But they didn't disappear. They went underground. Into the drawers of grandmothers who kept their tins of shea butter even after everyone around them switched to commercial moisturizers. Into the notebooks of women who wrote down their recipes, just in case. Into the memories of daughters who watched their mothers work and filed away what they saw, even if they didn't practice it themselves. Into the hands of women who kept pressing hair long after flat irons became available, because they knew the result was different. Better, more suited to their specific hair. The knowledge survived the 1950s intact. Mostly. What happened to it after that is a longer, more complicated story. But it survived. And that's remarkable. Because the forces working against it, economic pressure, commercial marketing, political upheaval, physical migration, all of that should have been enough to erase it. But women are stubborn. Knowledge is stubborn. When something works, really works, when it's been tested across generations and found to be true, it doesn't just disappear because something shinier comes along. It waits. It hides in drawers and notebooks and muscle memory. And eventually, someone goes looking for it, and finds it still there, waiting to be recovered. Here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. Because what happened to Black women's beauty knowledge in the decades after the 1950s isn't just a story of forgetting, it's also a story of distortion, of misrepresentation, of other people deciding what that knowledge meant, what it was worth, and who got to profit from it. Let's start with the most obvious distortion, the romanticization. Somewhere around the early 2000s, and accelerating dramatically after about 2010, a certain version of 1950s Black beauty culture became fashionable. Not the actual version, the aesthetic version. Pinterest boards full of photographs of Black women in perfect 1950s dresses, with perfect pressed hair, in beautiful kitchens. Instagram accounts celebrating vintage beauty secrets, with filtered photographs that made poverty look like artistry, and hardship look like charm. YouTube videos teaching the old-fashioned beauty methods that suddenly seemed innovative and natural and better than modern products. And some of that was genuine. Some of it was real recovery of real knowledge. Women actually going back to shea butter and castor oil and protective styles and finding that they worked better than the chemical-laden products they'd been sold. That part was good. But a lot of it was something else. A lot of it was aestheticization without context. It was taking the beauty practices and removing the history that shaped them, presenting the techniques without acknowledging the conditions that created them, celebrating the wisdom without honoring the suffering. Someone on YouTube making a video about deep conditioning with mayonnaise and calling it a forgotten beauty hack was genuinely sharing useful information. But they often didn't mention that the reason black women used mayonnaise in the first place was because they couldn't afford commercial conditioners, or because the commercial conditioners didn't work on their hair type, or because they were working 60 hours a week cleaning white women's houses and had to find ways to care for themselves with whatever was in the kitchen cabinet. Without that context, it becomes a cute trick. With that context, it becomes survival. Those are very different things. And when we strip the context, we strip the meaning. We turn lived experience into lifestyle content. And that's a kind of erasure, even when it's done with good intentions. Now let's talk about the beauty industry. Because the same industry that spent decades ignoring black women, that didn't make products for their hair or their skin, that treated them as if they didn't exist as consumers, eventually came back, with a vengeance. By the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, major beauty corporations started noticing something. The natural hair movement was growing. Black women were going back to natural hair in enormous numbers, and they were spending money on products for it. Not just a little money, a lot of money. The black hair care market was worth billions of dollars. And suddenly, those same corporations that had ignored black women for decades were very interested in natural hair. They started buying black-owned hair care companies. One by one, the companies that black entrepreneurs had built, the ones that actually understood black hair, that had been created specifically to serve black women, were acquired by multinational corporations. And sometimes the products stayed the same, but often they changed. The formulas were adjusted to cut costs. The ingredients that made them work were substituted for cheaper alternatives. The knowledge that had gone into creating them was replaced by marketing. And black women kept buying because the brand name was familiar, because the packaging said the same thing, because they didn't know the formula had changed. But their hair noticed. Their hair started breaking again, started drying out, started responding badly to products that used to work, and they couldn't figure out why, because no one told them the formula had changed. This is what happens when traditional knowledge gets absorbed into commercial systems. The knowledge gets stripped out, the profit stays. Now let's talk about something that happened specifically to the beauty secrets we've been discussing. Castor oil became trendy, not in the black community, which had known about it for generations, but in the mainstream, largely white wellness community, which discovered around 2015 that castor oil could help grow hair and eyelashes. Suddenly castor oil was everywhere. Wellness influencers were raving about it. Beauty editors were writing articles about this amazing new discovery. But it wasn't new. Black women had been using castor oil for hair growth for centuries. Jamaican black castor oil, a specific version produced in Jamaica using a traditional roasting method, had been used in Caribbean and Black American communities for as long as anyone could remember. The knowledge was old. The practice was old. What was new was that white women had noticed it. And when white women notice something, it becomes legitimate. It gets written about. It gets studied. It gets sold in nice packaging at Sephora for $40. And the black women who had been using it for generations, who had learned it from their grandmothers, who had never stopped using it even when it wasn't fashionable, they watched this happen with a mixture of feelings. Some felt vindicated. Finally, the mainstream was catching up to what we knew. Some felt irritated. You're discovering something we never stopped doing. Some felt invisible. This is being sold as a new discovery when it's thousands of years old and we never got credit for knowing it. That's the pattern. Black women develop knowledge, maintain knowledge, use knowledge. Mainstream culture ignores it. Then mainstream culture discovers it and presents it as something new, something trendy, something they found. And the black women who held the knowledge get cut out of the story. This isn't speculation. You can trace it with multiple ingredients. Shea butter, castor oil, coconut oil, protective hairstyles like braids and twists, scalp massages, deep conditioning, satin bonnets. Every single one of these was being practiced by black women long before it became a wellness trend. Every single one was eventually packaged, marketed, and sold back to consumers, often at much higher prices, without adequate credit to the communities that had preserved and practiced these methods. Now let's talk about television and movies. Because if you want to understand how the 1950s black beauty world has been remembered and distorted by popular culture, you have to look at what gets shown on screen. The 1950s, when represented in film and television, is almost always a white 1950s. The shows set in that era, the period dramas, the nostalgic films, they center white characters in white neighborhoods doing white things. When black characters appear, they're usually peripheral. They're the maid, the neighbor, the vague background figure, and their beauty practices are almost never shown. You never see a film set in the 1950s where a black woman's Saturday night hair routine is part of the story, where the beauty shop is a center of the narrative, where the knowledge being passed from grandmother to granddaughter is treated as worthy of screen time. Those stories exist. They've been written. Some of them have been made into films and documentaries. But they're niche. They're categorized as black films or documentaries about black hair. They don't get the mainstream distribution that the white 1950s nostalgia films get. And so the collective cultural image of that decade remains white, and black women's beauty culture remains invisible to anyone who doesn't specifically go looking for it. Which brings us to the internet. Because the internet has done two contradictory things simultaneously. On one hand, it has allowed black women to find each other, to share knowledge, to rebuild communities of practice that were disrupted by migration and commercialization. Natural hair forums, YouTube channels, Instagram accounts, TikTok communities have created enormous networks where black women share techniques, review products, recommend ingredients, and pass down knowledge in digital form. This is genuinely wonderful. Women who grew up in predominantly white communities, who didn't have access to older black women who knew the old methods, can now find that knowledge online. Women in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, in the UK, in France, in Brazil, can connect with black women in America and share techniques and find common ground. The internet has been, in some ways, a restoration of the community knowledge network that migration and commercialization disrupted. But on the other hand, the internet has also accelerated misinformation. Every week there's a new beauty secret being shared on social media. A new miracle ingredient, a new technique that promises to grow your hair 6 inches in a month or erase dark spots overnight. And most of it is nonsense. Or it's real knowledge presented without context, without nuance, without the accumulated understanding that comes from years of practice. Someone posts a recipe for a hair mask using 3 ingredients. It works for them, with their specific hair, in their specific climate, with their specific hair care history. And 10,000 women try it, with completely different hair and completely different histories, and get completely different results. Because hair is individual, because skin is individual, because the knowledge that made these methods work wasn't just the ingredients, it was the understanding of how to apply those ingredients to your specific hair, your specific skin, in your specific conditions. That understanding takes time. It takes practice. It takes learning from someone who knows your hair, not just anyone who's willing to post a video. And the internet can't fully replace that. It can get you close. It can give you the information, but the knowledge, the deep, embodied, specific knowledge that a grandmother who has been working with your hair since you were 3 years old has, that's irreplaceable, and we've been losing it. Not completely, not everywhere, but steadily. As the women who held it have gotten older, as the communities that maintained it have dispersed, as the commercial beauty industry has continued to promise easier solutions in prettier packages. And that loss is real. Even as the internet tries to recover it, even as influencers try to revive it, even as women go back to shea butter and castor oil and find that yes, it still works, just like Grandma said. The specific, personalized, relationship-based transmission of that knowledge, that's what we've lost. And it can't be replaced by a YouTube video, no matter how good the video is. So why did any of it survive at all? That's the question worth sitting with. Because by all logic, by all historical precedent, the beauty knowledge of enslaved women, of domestic workers, of women who had no institutional power, no access to publishing, no way to formally document what they knew, that knowledge should have disappeared. It should have been erased by slavery. It should have been disrupted by migration. It should have been replaced by commercial products. It should have been overwhelmed by the natural hair movement's politics. It should have been diluted by internet misinformation. At any point in the last 200 years, this knowledge could have simply stopped being transmitted, could have died with the women who held it, but it didn't. And understanding why it survived tells us something important, not just about black women's beauty practices, about how humans hold on to things that matter. The first reason it survived is usefulness. The simplest reason, the least romantic, but the most powerful. It worked. When you have something that genuinely works, that produces real results that you can see and feel and measure, you keep using it. You tell other people about it. They use it. They tell people. Knowledge that works is self-perpetuating. Castor oil grows hair, not a little. Genuinely, measurably, observably grows hair. Petroleum jelly seals moisture into skin. It does this reliably. It does it every time. Deep conditioning with protein-rich ingredients like egg strengthens hair. Not metaphorically, physically strengthens it, reducing breakage. These things work. And because they work, women kept using them even when they were told to use something else. Even when the advertisement promised something better. Even when the fashion changed and natural methods seemed old-fashioned. Because when your alternative is something that doesn't work as well, you go back to what does. That's not sentiment, that's pragmatism. The second reason it survived is flexibility. The knowledge was never rigid. It wasn't a fixed recipe that had to be followed exactly or it didn't count. It was a set of principles that could be adapted to available ingredients, to available tools, to changing circumstances. The principle is that hair needs moisture. The specific ingredient, whether it's shea butter or petroleum jelly or lard or coconut oil, can change based on what's available. The principle is that skin needs to be cleaned without being stripped. The specific cleanser, whether it's a cold cream made from scratch, or a commercial product, or just warm water and a soft cloth, can vary. The knowledge was portable because it was principled rather than prescriptive. And that meant it could survive migration. It could survive poverty. It could survive the unavailability of specific ingredients, because you could always find something that did the same job. And the understanding of why something worked, of the underlying principle, meant you could recognize a substitute when you found one. That flexibility is why the knowledge moved from Africa to America, from the rural South to the urban North, from the 1850s to the 1950s to today, without losing its essential truth. The third reason it survived is the network. The community of women who shared this knowledge was enormous. It wasn't held by one person, or one family, or one institution. It was distributed across millions of women, across thousands of communities, across generations. And when something is that widely distributed, it's nearly impossible to destroy completely. You could disrupt one community. You could separate one grandmother from her granddaughter. You could move one family from Alabama to Chicago. But you couldn't do it to everyone at once. Somewhere, always, someone was still practicing, still teaching, still passing it down. The network was the preservation system. Not a library, not a university, not a book. Women, talking to each other, showing each other, sitting in each other's kitchens. That network was the most resilient knowledge preservation system ever created, because it required no technology, no infrastructure, no permission from any institution, just women who trusted each other enough to share what they knew. The fourth reason it survived is identity. This is perhaps the deepest reason. The beauty practices became part of who black women were. Not just what they did, who they were. The Saturday routine wasn't just a chore. It was a ritual that marked the week, that connected you to your mother and your grandmother, that made you part of a lineage. When something becomes part of your identity, you fight to keep it. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when there are easier alternatives. Even when the culture tells you it's outdated. because giving it up feels like losing a piece of yourself. And black women, who had so much taken from them already, who had so much of their identity systematically attacked and erased and dismissed, held on to what they could. The beauty routines were something they controlled, something no one could take away, as long as they kept practicing. Something that said, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is where we come from. And that kind of identity-based knowledge is the hardest kind to erase, because it's not just information, it's self. The fifth reason it survived is the beauty shop. We keep coming back to this, because it keeps being important. The beauty shop was a physical space where the knowledge gathered, where it was practiced, demonstrated, discussed, refined, where novices learned from experts, where experts learned from each other, where the newest techniques were shared alongside the oldest ones, where a young woman getting her hair done for the first time was in the same room as a woman who had been doing hair for 40 years, and things passed between them. Not always verbally, sometimes just through watching, through absorbing, through being in the presence of someone who knew. That physical space was crucial, and black-owned beauty shops survived even when everything else was being desegregated, when everything else was being absorbed into mainstream white commercial culture. They survived because they served a function that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Not just the hair service, but the community, the knowledge network, the space to be fully yourself. And as long as those spaces survived, the knowledge had a home. The sixth reason it survived is stubbornness. And we should say that plainly, without softening it. Black women were stubborn about their knowledge. When someone told them their methods were old-fashioned, they kept using them. When commercial products promised better results and delivered worse ones, they went back to what they knew. When the culture told them their beauty routines were primitive or unscientific, they looked at their healthy hair and their glowing skin and they raised an eyebrow, because the results were evidence. And you can't argue with results. That stubbornness, that refusal to abandon what worked just because someone said there was something better, was what kept the knowledge alive through decades of commercial pressure. And there's something else too. The knowledge survived because it was attached to love. The moments when it was transmitted were almost always moments of care. A mother doing her daughter's hair, a grandmother teaching her granddaughter to moisturize, an aunt showing her niece how to wrap her hair at night. These were moments of intimacy, of attention, of being cared for. And the knowledge got embedded in that emotional context. So even when you grew up and moved away and stopped practicing some of the specific techniques, you remembered, because you remembered being cared for. You remembered sitting between your mother's knees while she braided your hair. You remembered the smell of the pomade. You remembered the sound of her voice telling you to sit still, stop squirming, we're almost done. And that memory kept the knowledge alive even when nothing else did. Even when you didn't practice it for years. Even when you'd switched to commercial products and given up the old methods entirely. The memory was still there. And eventually, maybe when you had your own daughter, or when you got frustrated enough with expensive products that didn't work, or when you got curious enough to go looking, you went back to what you remembered, and you found it still worked. That's why it survived. Not one reason, all of them together. Usefulness and flexibility and network and identity and community space and stubbornness and love, all of those things woven together created something strong enough to survive slavery, migration, commercialization, and the entire 20th century. And it's still here. A little battered, a little diluted, sometimes packaged in ways that strip out the context, but still here, still working, still being passed down, even if the kitchen has been replaced by a YouTube channel, even if the grandmother has been replaced by an influencer. The essence of it is still moving, from woman to woman, as it always has. Let's zoom out now. Let's pull back far enough that we can see the whole thing at once. Not just the pressing combs and the petroleum jelly and the Saturday routines and the beauty shops, but what all of it means. What it reveals about human beings when you look at it long enough and honestly enough. Because we've been talking about beauty practices, but we've really been talking about something much larger. We've been talking about what people do when the world tries to make them invisible. And the answer that comes through every single piece of this history, is that they make themselves visible to each other. When the mainstream culture says you don't exist, when the magazines don't show your face, when the advertisements aren't made for you, when the stores don't carry products for your hair or your skin, when the entire commercial and cultural apparatus of your society pretends you aren't there, you turn to the people next to you. You turn to your community. You build something inside the gap. And what black women built inside that gap in the 1950s, inside the space that white America left empty by ignoring them, was extraordinary. They built a complete, functional, sophisticated beauty culture that operated entirely outside of mainstream validation. It didn't need mainstream validation. It had its own standards, its own practitioners, its own economy, its own spaces, its own knowledge system. And it worked better than the mainstream version. That's remarkable. That's worth sitting with for a moment. That's not a story about victimhood. That's a story about human creativity under constraint, about what happens when you take away someone's access to the established systems and they build their own systems, from scratch, with what they have. And the systems they build are often better, because they're built from necessity, not from marketing. Because they're built to solve real problems, not to create new ones. Because they're built on knowledge that's been tested across generations, not on laboratory experiments designed to create dependency. There's something in human beings that refuses to accept invisibility. Something that insists on dignity even when dignity isn't being offered. Something that keeps reaching for beauty, for self-expression, for care, even when every external force is working against it. We see this across history, across cultures, across every context where people have been oppressed, marginalized, excluded. People kept making art. People kept singing. People kept decorating their bodies and their homes and their communities. People kept caring for each other, even in the worst conditions, even when it made no practical sense, even when there were more urgent things to worry about. Because beauty isn't a luxury. We think it is. We've been trained to think it is. We've been told that beauty is superficial, that caring about your appearance is vanity, that there are more important things. But history keeps proving that wrong. History keeps showing us that beauty is a survival mechanism, not physical survival, spiritual survival. It's the thing that keeps you from disappearing into the grind of just getting through the day. It's the thing that reminds you that you're a person, not just a worker. It's the thing that gives you something to be proud of, something to share, something to pass on. When a woman in 1955 spent 3 hours getting her hair ready for Sunday, she wasn't being frivolous. She was insisting on her own humanity. She was saying, I am more than the work I do for other people. I have a self. I have standards. I have care. I have skill. And that insistence, that refusal to let exhaustion and poverty and discrimination collapse her into just a function, just a worker, just a body for other people's use, that's one of the most profound human acts there is. Now let's talk about what this history reveals about knowledge. Specifically, about who gets to be considered knowledgeable. For most of recorded history, knowledge has been associated with institutions, universities, churches, governments, laboratories. If something was known, it was known by someone with credentials, someone with a title, someone who worked within an institution that validated their expertise. Knowledge that existed outside of those institutions, in communities, in families, in informal networks, was considered folklore, tradition, old wives' tales, not real knowledge, not serious knowledge. And this created an enormous blind spot, because enormous amounts of real, tested, effective knowledge lived outside of institutions. It lived in the hands of midwives who had delivered thousands of babies. It lived in the knowledge of herbalists who knew which plants treated which conditions. It lived in the routines of women who had been caring for hair and skin for generations. It lived in black kitchens in the American South and North, in beauty shops in Harlem and Chicago and Atlanta, in the hands of women who had no degrees but knew more about certain things than any laboratory-trained expert. But because it wasn't institutional, it wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't studied, it wasn't documented, it wasn't validated, and so it was invisible, right up until the moment when someone with institutional credentials discovered the same thing and published a paper about it. Then it became knowledge. Then it became something worth knowing. The ingredients that black women had been using for centuries, shea butter, castor oil, coconut oil, aloe vera, began to be studied by dermatologists and trichologists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And the studies found again and again that these ingredients worked. That shea butter genuinely moisturizes and protects skin. That castor oil genuinely promotes hair growth. That coconut oil genuinely penetrates the hair shaft in ways that most commercial conditioners don't. That aloe vera genuinely soothes and hydrates and reduces inflammation. The studies confirmed what black women had known for generations. But the studies got credited. The women didn't. That's a pattern worth naming. And it raises a question that goes beyond beauty practices. How much knowledge have we lost, or failed to find, because we only look for it in certain places? How much do we not know because we dismissed the people who knew it? How much human wisdom has disappeared because the people who held it weren't considered the right kind of people to hold wisdom? That's the big question this history opens up. And it doesn't have a comfortable answer. Now let's talk about what this reveals about beauty itself, about what beauty actually is, stripped of its commercial packaging and its cultural politics. Because when you look at what black women were doing in the 1950s, the core of it, the essential practice underneath all the specific techniques and ingredients, what you find is attention, care, consistent, patient, knowledgeable attention to the body. That's it. That's the secret. Not mayonnaise, not castor oil, not the pressing comb. Attention. The attention of a grandmother noticing that her granddaughter's scalp is dry and knowing what to do about it. The attention of a woman knowing her own hair well enough to recognize when it needs more moisture, when it needs less manipulation, when it needs to be left alone. The attention of consistent practice, of doing the same things, the right things, every week, every day, over years and decades. That's what created healthy hair, glowing skin, the results that seemed miraculous to people who didn't know the work behind them. Not a product, attention. And attention is something you cannot buy. You can buy ingredients, you can buy tools, you can buy someone else's time, but you cannot buy the knowledge that comes from paying attention to your own body over time. You cannot buy the understanding of what your specific hair needs, what your specific skin responds to, what works for you versus what works for someone else. That understanding can only come from practice, from paying attention, from the slow accumulation of observation and adjustment and learning. And this is perhaps the deepest truth this history has to offer. In a culture that is constantly trying to sell you the solution, the product, the shortcut, the 5-step routine that will solve everything, the women we've been talking about were practicing something much harder and much more valuable. They were paying attention. To themselves, to each other, to what worked. And that attention, maintained over lifetimes, transmitted across generations, is the actual secret. Not the mayonnaise. The attention behind the mayonnaise. Not the pressing comb. The skill behind the pressing comb. Not the silk scarf. The understanding of why the silk scarf matters, of what it protects, of how it fits into a larger system of care. That's what was beautiful about these practices. Not the individual techniques. The whole system. The system of consistent, knowledgeable, loving attention to the body. And here's the final human truth. We all need that. Not just black women, not just women, everyone. We all need someone who pays attention to us, who knows us well enough to notice when something is wrong, when something needs care, when something is beautiful. We all need to be in community with people who share knowledge freely, who teach without demanding credit, who pass down what they know because they love the person they're teaching. We all need rituals. Not the commercial kind. Not the kind that requires buying 17 products. The kind that marks time. That connects us to who we were yesterday and who we'll be tomorrow. That reminds us we're part of something longer than our own lives. The women we've been talking about had all of that. In their kitchen routines, in their beauty shops, in their Saturday night preparations, and their Sunday morning transformations. They had community, they had knowledge, they had ritual, they had attention. And they were beautiful. Not despite their circumstances, not in spite of their poverty and their exhaustion and their pain, but fully, completely, deeply beautiful. because they refused to let circumstances determine whether they deserved care. Because they insisted on caring for themselves and each other regardless of what the world thought. Because they understood, even if they never said it in these exact words, that beauty is not something the world gives you, it's something you practice. Every day, with what you have, for as long as you live. It's getting late now. The story is slowing down, the way stories do when they've said the most important things and are finding their way toward rest. And I want to take you somewhere quiet before we're done. Back to a specific moment, a small one, the kind that doesn't make it into history books. A woman, sometime in 1957, sitting on the edge of her bed. The children are asleep. The house is quiet. The radio in the kitchen has been turned off. Outside, the city is still making its city sounds, cars and distant voices, and the particular hum that cities make at night. But inside the bedroom it's still. She has a small jar of petroleum jelly on the nightstand. She's been on her feet for 10 hours. Her back aches in that low, deep way that means she probably won't sleep comfortably tonight. Her hands are dry from bleach and hot water. But before she lies down, she does what she always does. She opens the jar. She scoops out a small amount with 2 fingers. She rubs it between her palms to warm it, and she presses it into her face, working it into her cheekbones, her forehead, the soft skin around her eyes. She does her hands next, working the jelly into the cracks, between the fingers, around the knuckles. Then she reaches up and unties her scarf. She picks up her brush from the nightstand. She brushes her hair slowly, not quickly, the way you'd brush your teeth before rushing out the door. Slowly, one long stroke from root to tip, then another, and another, 50 strokes. She's counted them since she was a girl. Then she wraps her hair, smoothing it around her head in the pattern her mother showed her, tucking the ends, tying the scarf back in place. She puts the brush back on the nightstand. She lies down. And in the 30 seconds before sleep finds her, she is not a domestic worker. She is not a woman living in a city that doesn't want her. She is not tired or poor or invisible. She is just a woman who took care of herself today, who did what she knew to do, who will wake up tomorrow and do it again. There's a particular kind of peace in that, in having a practice, in knowing what to do with your hands, in the quiet competence of a routine that has become so familiar it requires no thought, only presence. That's what ritual does for us. It takes the anxiety of living and gives it somewhere to go. Instead of lying in the dark worrying about tomorrow, you're warming petroleum jelly between your palms. You're counting brush strokes. You're tying a knot in a scarf you've tied 1,000 times before. Your hands know what to do. And while your hands are doing it, your mind can rest. This is perhaps something we've forgotten in the age of 10-step routines and elaborate skincare systems and the constant pressure to be doing more, using more, optimizing more. The simple routines, the 2 or 3 things done faithfully every single night, those aren't inferior to the complex ones. They might be better, not because they use better ingredients, but because they're sustainable. Because you can do 3 things every night for 50 years without getting overwhelmed or running out of money or losing track of which step comes next. Because the simplicity is part of what makes them work. A routine you abandon because it's too complicated hasn't helped you. A routine you've done every night for 50 years, even a simple one, has changed your skin and your hair and possibly your relationship with yourself. The women we've been talking about understood this. Not as philosophy, as lived practice. They didn't have complicated routines because they didn't have time for complicated routines. They had work and children and exhaustion and 30 minutes at the end of the day if they were lucky. So they made those 30 minutes count. They made them count with knowledge, with the understanding of what their bodies needed and how to provide it with the simplest possible tools. And it worked. It worked for 50 years. And then for their daughters. And then for their daughters. Let's think for a moment about what gets passed down, not just in families, not just in beauty practices, but in general. What survives, what travels. The things that survive across generations are almost never the complicated things. They're almost never the things that required expensive equipment or institutional support or written documentation. The things that survive are the simple things, the embodied things, the things you can do with your hands that you learned by watching someone else do it with their hands. A song, a recipe, a way of folding cloth, a gesture of comfort, a beauty routine done quietly in a bedroom before sleep. These things survive because they live in bodies, not in books. Because they're transmitted in moments of closeness, of care, of attention. Because the learning happens almost without you noticing. You watched your mother do it for years before you did it yourself, and by the time you were old enough to do it yourself, you already knew how. The knowledge was already in your hands. There's something in this that feels important to carry forward. Not as a lesson exactly, not as advice, but as a kind of comfort. The idea that the most valuable things you know might be the quietest things. The things you don't think about. The things you do without fanfare. The things you learned from watching someone who loved you. Those things are worth something. Worth more, possibly, than the complicated, expensive, scientifically validated things that get written about in magazines. And the women who had nothing, who had no institutional validation, no commercial products made for them, no cultural recognition of their knowledge, they knew this intuitively. They held on to the quiet things. They held on to the simple routines. They held on to each other, and they created something that has lasted long enough for us to be talking about it here, now, tonight. That's not a small thing. That's actually enormous. Think about what it took. Women with no power, no money, no institutional support, no cultural visibility, managed to preserve a sophisticated knowledge system across multiple centuries, across an ocean crossing, across slavery, across migration, across every attempt to erase them. And they did it with their hands, with their voices, with their willingness to sit with each other and share what they knew. There's something almost unbelievable about that, and yet it's documented. It's real. The knowledge is still here. The practices still work. And somewhere tonight, a woman is doing what that woman in 1957 did. She's sitting on the edge of her bed. Her children are asleep. The house is quiet. And she's rubbing something warm between her palms, something her mother taught her about, something that came from someone before that, in a chain that stretches back further than any of them could name. And she's doing it because it works. Because it's what you do before sleep. Because someone showed her how. Let your mind rest on that image for a moment. The continuity of it. The chain of women, across time, across miles, across everything that tried to break the chain, doing the same quiet thing before sleep. Caring for themselves, caring for each other, passing it down. That chain is still unbroken. And you're part of it now, just by knowing the story, just by listening. Just by letting it settle into the quieter parts of your mind, where it will sit alongside everything else you know about what it means to be human, and to keep going, and to take care of yourself, and each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Let your breathing slow a little. Let the weight of the day start to soften at the edges. The knowledge is safe. The chain is unbroken. The women who held it are still holding it, in memory, in practice, in the routines of their daughters and their daughters' daughters. And tonight, in rooms all over the world, someone is wrapping their hair before sleep. Someone is moisturizing their face in the dark. Someone is doing the simple, faithful things they were taught by someone who loved them. And it's enough. It's always been enough. We started with a contradiction. Do you remember? We started with the image of the 1950s that everyone carries. The perfect photographs. The poodle skirts. The red lipstick. The studio lighting that made everything look clean and simple and solved. And we said there was an entire world inside that decade that those photographs never showed. A world of kitchens and pressing combs and petroleum jelly, and castor oil, and silk scarves and Saturday nights spent in rollers. A world of women who knew things, who had always known things, who kept knowing things even when no one was watching, even when no one was writing it down, even when the entire culture was pretending they didn't exist. We've traveled a long way since then. We went back to West Africa and found shea butter being harvested by women who knew exactly what they were doing, who had been doing it for longer than any written record can track. We followed that knowledge onto ships and across an ocean and watched it adapt, watched it survive, watched it find new ingredients and new methods in a new land, without losing its essential understanding of what skin and hair need to thrive. We watched it move through slavery and emerge on the other side still intact, still functional, still being passed from hand to hand in the darkness. We watched it build an economy, small, informal, underground, but real. Women making products in kitchens and selling them from their front doors. Women doing hair in their living rooms and charging enough to feed their children. We watched it face the pressure of commercialization, of civil rights politics, of migration and modernization, and we watched it bend but not break. We watched it get discovered by the internet and romanticized and stripped of context and sold back to people at $40 a jar, and we watched it survive even that, because it was never really about the jar. It was always about the knowledge. The understanding of what the body needs and how to provide it. And that understanding doesn't live in a jar. It lives in people. In the specific, patient, accumulated knowledge of women who paid attention to themselves and each other over lifetimes. And that's something a corporation can't acquire, can't replicate, can't sell you at any price. You can only get it the way it was always transmitted. From someone who knows, to someone who's willing to learn. In a moment of closeness, of attention, of care, let's come back to the pressing comb one more time. That heavy piece of metal sitting on the stove, heating slowly while someone sections hair and warms grease between their palms. Earlier tonight we talked about what it meant as a tool, as a symbol, as a site of skill and pain and transformation. But there's one more thing it means. Presence. To press hair safely, to do it well, to do it without burning, without breaking, without damaging, you have to be completely present. You cannot be thinking about what you have to do tomorrow. You cannot be distracted by the radio or the conversation in the next room. You have to be here, now, paying complete attention to the heat of the comb, to the tension of the hair, to the sound it makes passing through, to the way the texture changes under your hands. That kind of presence, that forced, total attention to the moment you're in, is actually very hard to achieve. And most of us spend most of our lives trying to achieve it. We pay for meditation classes. We buy apps that remind us to breathe. We read books about mindfulness and presence and being here now. And those women in 1955, they achieved it every Saturday night. Not because they were enlightened, but because the task demanded it. Because if you let your mind wander while you were pressing hair, someone got burned. So you didn't let it wander. You stayed present, completely present, in the small, warm, specific reality of this moment, these hands, this hair, this person trusting you to take care of them. And maybe that's part of why those routines felt like rituals, not just because they were repeated, but because they required presence. They pulled you out of your worrying mind and put you firmly in your body, in the room, in the moment. And that's a kind of rest, actually. Even if it doesn't look like rest from the outside, even if it looks like work. Inside, it was the mind resting from itself, from the endless forward-thinking and backward-looking that exhausts us. Into the simple, clear, present reality of hands doing a thing they know how to do. That's the gift these routines gave, beyond the beauty results. They gave presence. They gave the body a reason to be here, now, doing this one thing. And that's a gift that's worth having, worth protecting, worth passing down. There's a particular kind of woman this history keeps pointing back to. Not the famous ones, not Madam Walker, though she matters. Not the civil rights leaders, though they matter. The ordinary ones. The woman who cleaned other people's houses and came home and still did her hair. The woman who worked double shifts and still set her rollers on Saturday night. The woman who had nothing and still knew the difference between doing it right and doing it halfway. The woman who, when asked what she used on her skin, said, "Vaseline," and watched the questioner fail to believe her. That woman. She knew something that the whole commercial beauty industry, with all its laboratories and all its marketing and all its packaging, never fully figured out. That the body responds to consistent care, to simple things done faithfully, to attention, to knowledge, to the willingness to show up for yourself every single day, even when you're tired, even when the world isn't paying attention, even when no one is watching. She knew that beauty was a practice, not a product, not a result. Not something you achieve and then have. A practice. Something you do, over and over, for the rest of your life. And that the doing of it, the showing up for it, the maintaining of the routine, was itself the point. Not just the smooth skin. Not just the healthy hair. But the act of caring for yourself, of saying every single day, I am worth this time, I am worth this attention, I am worth the 30 minutes it takes to do this right. That's what those routines were saying. Every time. Even when the woman doing them didn't consciously think of it that way. Even when she was just doing what she'd always done because it was what you did. The act itself carried the meaning. The meaning was in the doing. And somewhere deep in your body, in the part of you that recognizes things before your mind catches up, you know exactly what I mean. You know the feeling of taking care of yourself and having it matter, of doing the simple things faithfully and watching them work over time, of being in a routine that is yours, that you know, that your hands could do in the dark. That feeling is old, much older than you. It goes back through your mother and your grandmother and every woman before them who understood that the body is worth caring for, that the 30 minutes before sleep are worth spending on yourself, that the simple things, done faithfully, are enough. They are always enough. So tonight, before you sleep, let that be the last thought. Not the history, not the complexity, not the injustice or the resilience or the analysis. Just the image. A woman at the end of a long day, a jar on the nightstand, hands warming something between them. A slow, deliberate act of care, and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing what to do, from having been taught, from being part of a chain that goes back further than you can see. Let your eyes close on that image. Let your breathing slow into it. The knowledge is safe. The chain is unbroken. And you are part of it. Just by being here tonight. Just by listening. Good night.